Hey, folks. Thank you for your patience. Glad that you're here with me tonight. We're going to have yet another late night conversation. So glad you're here. Thanks for your patience, and let's have another chat.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. We're just living life, doing things the way we do. And tonight we're going to have yet another late night conversation. The way these chats tend to work is I give my opening remarks. The opening remarks are then followed by a roll call. And then the roll call is followed by me answering your questions for the rest of the night. So if you've got a question for me to answer, you can send a super chat on YouTube, or you can send a Rumble rant on Rumble. Those are the two ways in which I receive your questions. So if you're on Facebook, you got to go to YouTube. You got to go to Rumble if you want to send a question. I can't see Facebook questions that come in, but I can certainly see Rumble and YouTube questions. So glad you all are here. Quick reminder that every morning we are having morning messages on the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel as a way of keeping our community together, keeping people plugged in and engaged with each other. We have every morning messages on the CPI YouTube channel. So start your day with revolutionary hope and optimism as we hold each other up and stand with each other amid this society being what it is. Go to the CPI YouTube channel, subscribe, and get notifications so that you can be aware of the morning messages that happen every morning. It's a great way to do things. And on top of that, while we're at it, on top of that, if you would like to make a morning message, if you want to support other members of our community, we need people to step up to the plate. I can't do all of them. Gabby can't do all of them. Rachel can't do all of them. We have a lot of great members who are doing great messages. I'm actually going to show one of the recent messages on here tonight from a member who did a great job. But we need you to step up to the plate and submit morning messages. And so we have this link where you can submit a morning message as a way to stand with this community and support our work and support each other. That's the point of CPI, is so that people can become connected with each other and we can build a real anti-imperialist coalition. That is the idea. That's what we want to do. And so I would hope that you can be part of that community, submit morning messages, tune in every morning for the morning messages. That's what I would encourage you to do. The Center for Political Innovation is an amazing organization. We are doing some great things. I am headed to Chicago on Tuesday morning with 1,000 copies of this, our Do You Believe in Growth pamphlet, and 1,000 copies of a new edition of our Kamala Harris book. We are going to be distributing them during the DNC. Very, very exciting. My book has sold well over 2,000 copies in the last week. People are impressed that my message and my analysis of Kamala Harris that I wrote 4 years ago was right on point, and that so right on point, they suppressed my book. They banned it for a week from Amazon. And in doing so, they only drew even more attention to it. There's been an explosion of interest in what I have to say about Kamala. Very exciting what's going on. And Yeah, and so we are just going to keep going with this message because, what I said points to some realities, not just about Kamala Harris, but about American politics that everyone needs to be aware of. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that. If you want to support the work that we do, if you want to help us, support our efforts to distribute the pamphlet at the DNC, the books at the DNC, the Kamala Harris book, etc., you can donate on the GoFundMe that we set up to, get this book to the DNC. I'll drop that link in the chat. That's one way you can support our work. We are just going to keep going. We are anti-imperialists to our core. We believe in anti-imperialism. So get the suppressed book to the DNC. That is our GoFundMe. And I'll be hitting the road on Tuesday morning with my friend, a good friend of mine. We're going to be hitting the road, and we got 1,000 of these. The Do You Believe in Growth pamphlet, which basically just gives you an introduction to what CPI is all about, what our beliefs are. And then we also have the new edition of the Kamala Harris book with a great new cover designed by Peter. It's just great stuff. So, yeah, a lot of exciting things are happening. So, as I said, if you would like, if you have a question, right? We got one question already. I got a question for me to answer in the second half of the show. Send it my way. First opening remarks, then roll call, then I answer super chat and Rumble rant questions. So keep those questions rolling in. Give me something to talk about in the second half of the show. And then now I guess I'll jump into my opening remarks for tonight. Folks, I've been to Venezuela. I've seen up close the achievements of what's happened as a result of the transition towards socialism in this impoverished, developing, but oil-rich country. And I have studied it in depth, and I'm very, very happy to talk about it at great length, because the way U.S. media discusses Venezuela is dishonest. And right now, Maduro is the obvious winner of a recent election that happened. And the Carter Center and others have said that, the Venezuelan election system is one of the fairest and cleanest in the world. And I've been to Venezuela. I've been to the Elections Commission. I was there in 2015 to monitor the elections that happened there. And I saw how the elections happen in Venezuela. And I saw how they have electronic ballots and paper ballots. And the paper ballot receipts must match the electronic vote, or else they have to recount the entire precinct. There's a huge amount of transparency in the Venezuelan electoral process, an absolutely huge amount of transparency. They do not rig the elections. The elections in Venezuela are very, very democratic. And they're more transparent and more democratic than anything that we have over here. There's no state that I'm aware of where they have an electronic vote and a paper vote, and they have to match, or else they recount the entire thing. I've never heard of that in the United States. That's what they have in Venezuela. And let me also add that in Venezuela, in addition to, the fair elections, they still call them a dictatorship, even when they allowed the opposition to be in the streets and be violent. Even when, I went to Venezuela, I saw ads for the opposition on television. I saw opposition anti-communist rallies on the streets, but somehow it's a brutal dictatorship. This guy, Juan Guaido, was claiming to be the president, with the United States recognizing him, and nothing happened to him. And he walked around the country saying he was the legit president, it just goes to show you that no matter what, no matter how democratic, no matter how open a country is, if it's anti-imperialist, they're going to call it a dictatorship. And that's what you have to remember. There will never be a socialism that the New York Times will approve of. There never will be a socialism that the New York Times will approve of. And people need to get out of their heads that somehow, if we're just democratic enough, if we're just free and open enough, the ruling class is going to call it an open, free society is going to admit that the communists are the legit leaders of the country. They never do that, right? They will never tolerate a genuine socialist society. They never will. And I've said this in my debates. I brought up Venezuela in my debate with Destiny, and it came up in my debate with Vosh as well. And we might watch some of that here a little bit later, but we'll see. We might watch some of that a little bit later, but not to start off with. I want to start off by telling you what you need to know about Venezuela, because I saw this. I called this stream, stand with Maduro, learn from Venezuela. And because there's certain things about the Venezuelan Revolution that you need to understand, how Venezuela became a socialist country. These are things that are quite important, and the context. You can learn about the revolutionary process. You can learn about it, right? You can learn about the revolutionary process by looking at what different countries have done as they've transitioned towards socialism. And you can learn about it. And these are important things to talk about. So let's start out with, what is the context of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela? Where did it come from? Well, in Latin America, throughout the Cold War, the majority of governments that the United States backed in South and Central America were military dictatorships. 1953, the government of Guatemala was overthrown, and it was toppled and replaced with a government, that was a military regime. Jacobo Arbenz, the elected president of Guatemala, was toppled. You had the dictator Somoza in Nicaragua. You had all kinds of military dictatorships backed up by the United States to prevent communist revolution, because the communists had led the trade unions, because the communists had mass support, because Cuba had a socialist revolution in 1959. All across South and Central America, you had brutal authoritarian military dictatorships. And under these brutal authoritarian military dictatorships, it was impossible to organize in the cities. If you organized, openly as a communist, you would be disappeared and never heard from again. Your body would be found in the streets. College students were arrested all the time for organizing protests for free speech, for democracy. And if you went to Colombia, if you went to Peru, if you went to Chile, and a lot of these places, they had brutal authoritarian military dictatorships. And if you spoke up and you were openly talking about communism, or if you were organizing strikes among workers or anything like that, you would be disappeared. You had Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. You had a number of brutal authoritarian military regimes. And so what the revolutionaries did is it tended to be students on the college campuses who would get recruited into communist groups, and they would travel to communist countries. They would go to Cuba for training and stuff. And then they would go into the countryside and they would organize the indigenous people, the rural people, the dark-skinned indigenous people who lived in the countryside, were the poorest of the poor. And they would do protracted guerrilla warfare, and they would organize the impoverished people of the countryside, and they would build a peasant guerrilla army. And in a number of Latin American countries in the 60s and the 70s, you had very effective insurgencies that seized big parts of the country. And there was the Tricontinental Congress that was founded by Cuba and Che Guevara. That's where Che Guevara gave his famous 2-3 many Vietnams speech. And all across South and Central America, the communists would go into the countryside and they would organize guerrilla warfare. And these countries would have civil war between the brutal military dictatorship backed by the United States and a peasant insurgency backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, and usually led by students, wealthier students who became communists and then went to the countryside and set up guerrilla armies. Right. There was the military theories of Che Guevara. There were the military theories of Mao Zedong, protracted people's war, Foucaultism, all of these theories. That was how communists operated in South and Central America, because you couldn't operate openly as a communist because these countries were brutal military dictatorships. You could not organize for a peaceful transition to socialism. So people were forced to engage in armed struggle. Venezuela was one of those countries. There were communist rebels in Venezuela who seized big chunks of territory. And Hugo Chavez was a member of the Venezuelan military who actually fought against communists and arrested communists and rounded them up. And he was part of the Venezuelan military's anti-insurgency campaign in the 70s and 80s in Venezuela. Little known fact, right? He was part of the military who went around fighting the communist rebels in the rural areas of Venezuela. So that was the lay of the land. And in Nicaragua, the communists were very successful. And in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas were able to take power. In El Salvador, the communists were able to take power. There was a civil war that was, it went on for a while, and communists were able to take power in El Salvador, but then they lost power. It was complicated. So, in Cuba, they had power. You had the FARC in Colombia. There were various armed insurgent groups that were very effective, armed by the Soviet Union, armed by Cuba. And this is why Cuba was designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism. They labeled these armed groups that were supported by Cuba and the Soviet Union. They labeled them terrorist groups. And because Cuba would, they would all go to Cuba for military training. They would get their guns from Cuba. Cuba was designated by the USA as a state sponsor of terrorism. And that was the Cold War setup. But in the 80s, the Cold War ended. It came to an end. And one thing that a lot of leftists do not understand, I'm sure stupid Danny Haiphong has no understanding of this whatsoever, because it doesn't fit the standard leftist playbook. And it's taken me a while to understand it, because there's nuance to these issues, right? Standard leftists have no way of comprehending this. But what happened during the late 1980s and early 90s is that the military dictatorships that the USA had backed during the Cold War all started getting toppled around the same time the Soviet Union was falling. Now, this is a nuanced, important point, right? Why were these military dictatorships falling, right? Why did Pinochet in Chile get toppled? Why did various military governments, U.S.-backed authoritarian military regimes, why did they all start falling in the late 80s? Well, it was because of the fact that the United States had tolerated and built up these military regimes because of the threat of communist revolution, but that they were a barrier to austerity. And this is an important point, right? A military dictatorship is very expensive. And often these military dictatorships engaged in a lot of economic development and Bonapartism. With the military, they set up factories. With the military, they handed out the goods. They usually had like a military class of people that, served in the military or were tied to the military and started their own company that got a subsidy from the military. And that among the wealthier people, kind of the urban middle classes of these various developing countries, there was a layer of people who, made out pretty well and got subsidized and paid off. And that's why they tolerated the military dictatorship. They tolerated it because it was helping them financially, right? And that's an important thing to remember. These authoritarian military regimes would not have stayed in power if there wasn't a layer of people in the middle class of Guatemala and the middle class of Honduras, and the middle class of Colombia, the middle class of Venezuela, who financially benefited from it. And so while these military governments were brutally repressing the poor people and outlawing any notion of communism, they were also handing out the goods to a layer of middle class people, the urban middle class. And that was very expensive. And so as the Soviet Union was falling and as the danger of communist revolution was not as blatant, when Cuba experienced the special period and its economy was doing very badly in the 1990s, they had limited electricity, they couldn't get any oil. It was a very bad time in Cuba's history. Cuba's ability to support communist uprisings was limited. Under those circumstances, the USA said, we really don't need these authoritarian military dictatorships anymore because they're too expensive. And because these military dictators tend to do economic things that are not in the overall interest of imperialism, right? In order to stay in power, these dictators have to hand out the goods. And the most blatant example of that is in Panama, right? Manuel Noriega was an anti-communist dictator. But in order to stay in power, he built airports, he started providing for people, and the USA turned against him, and he wasn't going to give up power. And so eventually the United States invaded Panama and ousted Manuel Noriega, because even though he was an anti-communist military dictator, he started pivoting in a good direction because he wanted to stay in power. And the main way these military Bonapartist regimes would stay in power was by handing out the goods. George Soros, and this is what you need to remember, George Soros, the liberal activist who was funding the color revolutions all across Eastern Europe to overthrow the communist governments, right? He funded dissident artists and dissident movements in the Soviet Union and in Prague and in Czechoslovakia and in East Germany and various places. George Soros, right? He also funded protest movements in Chile to bring down Pinochet. He also funded protest movements throughout South and Central America to bring down military dictators. And it wasn't because he believed in human rights. It's because these military dictatorships were no longer necessary. They were an impediment to imperialism. And nobody else is going to give you this analysis, right? All your old lefties, your old lefties who are stuck in the 60s and 70s, who have this old outdated playbook, they don't understand this. It's too complicated for them. They think military dictators bad, communists good. Of course, I agree with that. But those military dictators were also an expense for the imperialists, right? It's kind of like corrupt labor union bosses. They don't want to have any labor union in their factory, even if it's a corrupt union, but they might have to tolerate the corrupt union to prevent a communist union. There's nuance to this. And so at the same time that the communist governments of Eastern Europe were all falling and imperialism was retaking the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, you also saw the fall of various military regimes that the United States had backed up to fight against communism. In South Korea, the military rule was brought to an end. And communists were involved in the protests for democracy, but they'd been doing that the whole time. And suddenly there were a bunch of liberal NGO activists who got out in the front of it and were leading it. And George Soros and the Open Society Institute and all of these groups were toppling the military dictatorships. At the same time, they were toppling the Marxist and communist governments of Eastern Europe. So, and their goal was openly, they want total free trade, open free market capitalism. And these military dictatorships, they weren't going to do it, right? For a long time, Mexico had an authoritarian military government called the People's Revolutionary Institute, right? And they used kind of the legacy of the Mexican Revolution, but they were super anti-communist. But you'll notice in the 1990s, the because it had been kind of an authoritarian government that handed out the goods, was replaced by Vicente Fox. Vicente Fox came in and he was an advocate of neoliberalism. The PRI had been this kind of, authoritarian regime to stabilize Mexico. But then Vicente Fox came in with NAFTA and looted Mexico. You can go all throughout South and Central America, all throughout Latin America. You can see this pattern of the authoritarian right-wing governments being removed at the same time that the Soviet Union and communism is being removed. Again, nobody else gives you this analysis. I give it to you. I talk about these things. Nobody else does, right? They want to make it sound like these right-wing governments, they just fell because of popular will. And no, it's more complicated than that. Yes, Brazil, great Brazil, right? Portuguese-speaking Brazil, same story, right? I mean, this is what was going on. So as these right-wing authoritarian governments were toppled, they were replaced with liberal democratic open societies. They were replaced with elected governments, but these governments were very, very weak. And these governments were reliant on the IMF and the World Bank for loans. And what they did is they auctioned their country off to the highest bidder. right? And Naomi Klein writes about this in her book, The Shock Doctrine. She writes about, it started out, Chile was kind of the test case, but after Chile, you had Bolivia, and Bolivia sold off its government-run oil industry, and it sold off its state-run assets, and that these countries were up for sale, more or less, right? Ecuador gave up its currency and adopted the U.S. dollar as its currency. And these countries, they sold off their state-run oil industries. They cut government services. And these new democratic governments that came in were so weak and pathetic, they would just roll over and let the country be economically looted by the United States. In order to get the IMF loans, they would let the IMF advisors run their economies. And they would say, look, if you're going to get a loan, you need to cut government jobs. And so they would cut a bunch of government jobs. They come back and they would do it. It's not enough. You got to cut more government jobs. And, it got to the point that, in a lot of these countries, in a lot of these countries in South and Central America, like the electricity would go off in neighborhoods for weeks and not get fixed because the government was so corrupt and there was so little little resources being spent on things like public infrastructure that the electricity would go off for weeks. And we get to the point the garbage wouldn't be collected because the government hadn't hired enough sanitation workers, etc., and the garbage wouldn't be collected. And like basic societal functions stopped working in various Latin American countries. And it was a disaster. I visited Ecuador in 1999 when I was a kid, and I saw a man-made famine created by these policies. I was there and I saw such desperate poverty. These were all people that had fled from the countryside. The crash on the Asian markets, the fact that Ecuador had been forced to give up its own currency and sell off its state-run oil industry. I went to Ecuador when I was 12 in 1999, and I saw free market neoliberalism in effect. The country was sold off to the highest bidder, and it had lost its own currency. It was an economic disaster. And this was happening in country after country after country. So in Venezuela, one of the things that the new open democratic governments did was that they cut the subsidies of public transportation, and they made it very expensive for people to go to work, and people relied on the public transportation system. So there was a rebellion called the caracazo. And that rebellion was considered to be, kind of the beginning of the Bolivarian movement, right? Is that the people of Caracas, which is the capital of Venezuela, they were angry about the rise in the cost of public transportation. And so they went out and rioted. And there were riots in response to, the rising cost of public transportation. And shortly after the riots, a military leader, a popular military leader who was a nationalist. He wasn't a communist. He called himself a Bolivarian after Simón Bolívar. And he said he was not a communist or a capitalist. He just wanted what was best for Venezuela. A popular military leader took his division of the military and tried to overthrow the government because he saw that there was a mass outrage about the cuts in public spending. And he was somewhat of an economic nationalist, but he'd been an anti-communist. He had killed a lot of communists. He had been, the leader of an anti-communist division of the military in the 70s and 80s that had gone around fighting communists in the countryside. He attempted to seize power in a military coup to stop austerity. He thought he could ride the wave of populist, anti-austerity, anti-cuts in public spending protests, and he could seize power. And he was not successful. He failed, and he went to prison for it. He was imprisoned for trying to overthrow the government. And he spent a few years in prison for organizing this attempted military coup to seize control of Venezuela. But this all points to an important thing that I just can't reiterate enough. So I talked about how earlier, under the military dictatorships, the tactic that the communists used was waging guerrilla warfare in the countryside. But as these Latin American countries are transitioning to being open societies, right, as they're having free elections again, and as these new governments are bringing in dramatic austerity, the communists changed their tactics. And this is what is really, really important to understand. the situation changed. It was no longer a military dictatorship. You could organize in the cities and not get murdered. You could hand out leaflets about communism. You could openly operate in the cities and not get killed. And austerity, cuts in public spending, was creating kind of a popular reaction. Average people were not happy about economic austerity being imposed. You had the caracazo in Venezuela. You had popular movements in Bolivia, the water rights protests and the miners' strikes that happened in Bolivia. And you had these popular mass movements that emerged that were in response to austerity. And this created an opening. And so the communists, who previously had been in the countryside trying to build peasant armies, went to the cities. And in the cities, they adopted the tactic of building a popular front. Right? That was the thing. Previously, their tactic had been waging guerrilla warfare or people's war in the countryside. But under the new circumstances, they adopted the tactic of engaging in a popular front against austerity. There was a division in the ruling class about the austerity being imposed by the IMF and the World Bank, and they built up and aligned themselves with the anti-austerity movement, the movement against cuts in public spending. It was a dramatic change in tactics. And in Cuba, they had big conferences. And Fidel started talking about neoliberalism and the need to oppose neoliberalism. And Cuba sponsored these big conferences from around the world where academics like Richard Wolff and academics like Slavoj Žižek and all kinds of academics who weren't even communists were flown to Cuba. And Cuba studied what was going on and sponsored academics to write books about neoliberalism. And by the end of the 1990s, a mass movement had developed in Latin America based on the division in the ruling class created by neoliberal economics. And it was a change in tactics. And this is what is very important. If the communists in Latin America had just kept doing the guerrilla warfare thing, they would have been left behind. In the FARC of Colombia, that's what they did. The FARC of Colombia, the Communist Party of Colombia, voted to join the government and do what the other communists throughout Latin America were doing. And they refused, and they remained in the countryside and remained an armed group, and they remained isolated. That's why Cuba cut off its financial support for the communists of Colombia, for the FARC in Colombia, right? And this is important to understand. So the communists changed their tactics, and instead they positioned themselves at the center of anti-austerity movements. And they did good old-fashioned communist community organizing. In Caracas, you know, when the electricity would go out, they would organize everyone in the neighborhood to stop going to work and strike until they turned the power back on, right? When they stopped picking up the garbage in their neighborhoods, the Communist Party would send their members out to go pick up the garbage and dump it on the highway in the rich people's neighborhood in order to raise awareness about the fact no one was picking up their garbage. These were the tactics that they adopted. Community organizing, and the church was a really big part of it. The Roman Catholic Church was a very, very big part of it. But also, what's interesting is some of these Pentecostal and evangelical churches were also a big part of it. And you wouldn't think so. A lot of these evangelical churches were set up to fight communism, right? There was, the Catholic Church in the 70s and 80s was considered by the United States to be soft on communism. The Sandinistas had Roman Catholic priests. There were priests and nuns that were murdered. And so the United States and U.S. intelligence funded a lot of missionaries to go to South and Central America and try to convert the people there away from the Catholic Church because they thought the Catholic Church was too soft on communism. So there's been a big rise of Pentecostalism and a lot of evangelical traditions among indigenous folks because they considered the Catholic Church to be, and the Catholic tradition in Latin America to be, a threat. But those churches, the Pentecostal churches, et cetera, are much less centralized, right? The Catholic Church, they all have to take orders from Rome, from the Vatican. It all gets back to the Vatican. right? You got your archdiocese and you got your bishops, and it all gets back to the Pope. Not so among evangelicals, right? A local guy who can preach, if he can get some money together and he can set up a church, he can have his own church and he can do his own thing. And he's got Bibles and he's got a band to play. And the evangelical movements of Latin America, even though there was a lot of CIA money and a lot of funding pouring into it from the West, they were much more decentralized, right? And because of that, you would get a lot of these local preachers who maybe they were against communism because they believe in God and they're not atheists, but they were for people in their neighborhood having jobs. They were for people in their neighborhood having electricity. They were for people in their neighborhood having access to health care. And so in their own blatant interest, because they want the members of their congregation to be able to put more in the offering plate, they shifted their alliances, right? And you had a number of these evangelical ministers, and they didn't have to get permission from the Pope to do it, right? And so you had a number of these Pentecostal and evangelical ministers who would go over to the anti-austerity movement side. And some in the Catholic Church were sympathetic, but the Catholic Church was much more limited and restrained in its alliance with the anti-austerity protests. But you know, they could make real inroads. There was still a very anti-communist evangelical wing tied to Israel. You find a lot of Pentecostal churches in South and Central America that have Israeli flags in their windows, so it's complicated. But a lot of these Pentecostal and evangelical ministers would go over to the side of mass popular movements in the 1990s. So in 1999, Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela. And he won on a platform of saying he wasn't for capitalism or socialism. He was for what was best for Venezuela. And he came in and he won the elections in a sweep, saying he wanted to build a new constitution that would be more democratic. His political party was originally called the Movement for the Fifth Republic. And he took office as this popular military guy who'd attempted a military coup, who'd gone to prison and got out of prison and won the elections. And he took power. He was elected. And after he took power, there was a wave of mudslides in the country. And, you know, Venezuela's got a lot of hills, and there was heavy rains, and that led to these mudslides happening in the country. And so what Hugo Chavez did in response to those mudslides was history in the making. And trust me, at the time, there were a lot of communists who were like, oh, Chavez is a phony. Chavez is a fraud. They didn't understand how things work. They just, you know, Chavez wasn't a communist at the time. Chavez was not preaching anti-imperialism or socialism. He was just preaching he was going to do what was best for Venezuela. You know, he wanted popular economic reforms. A lot of people, a lot of hard leftists didn't like him. But the official Communist Party of Venezuela saw Hugo Chavez from a good light and helped him get elected as a Popular Front tactic, as part of the anti-austerity Popular Front coalition. He got elected, and when these mudslides happened, Hugo Chavez got on TV and he called on the people of Venezuela to act. And he sent the military to go help the people who'd been affected by the mudslides. And that had never been done before in Venezuela's history. You had a president who got on television and called out the army to go help people, not to break strikes, not to put down an uprising, but to help people. And so the army was sent to these neighborhoods that were affected by the mudslides to help people. And then on top of that, he then called on people in their own neighborhoods to form community groups called Bolivarian circles that would help try to improve things in the neighborhood, help people affected by the mudslides. And everyone was blown away by how their president had his shit together. And he had a TV show every Sunday called Hello President, that every Sunday he would have his TV show where he would address the nation, and he would take phone calls from people, and he would address the country. And he mobilized these community groups called Bolivarian circles, and he sent the military in to help people. And people thought this guy is pretty decent. And so he said, look, I want to ratify this new constitution. this Bolivarian constitution. And so they put it to a popular vote, and the people overwhelmingly voted for the new constitution because they were blown away. This seemed like the first real president Venezuela had ever had. He was really getting the job done. He was a military guy who was getting the job done. So then he passed the new constitution, and after that, 9/11 happened. And after 9/11 happened, he got on TV and he showed the bombing of Afghanistan. And he said, look, obviously 9/11 was horrible. Obviously terrorism is never acceptable, but it's not legitimate to go and invade Afghanistan. It's not legitimate to kill innocent children with bombs. And he showed U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. On top of that, even though he wasn't a communist, he appointed a member of the Communist Party to his cabinet. I believe it was something related to labor unions, Department of Labor, something like that. He appointed a member of the Communist Party to his cabinet as a favor to the Communist Party because the Communist Party had been so essential in campaigning for him. He gave them a low-level cabinet position. And that drove the right wing of Venezuela crazy. How dare they do that? And the United States saw Venezuela as potentially a threat. And so in 2002, there was an attempted military coup against Hugo Chavez. And Hugo Chavez was arrested, and it seemed like the government was overthrown. But then the rank and file soldiers seized control of the presidential palace and rose up and brought him back to power. And he came back into power in 2002, and the coup attempt failed. And after that, he was very, very powerful. And he changed, the oil was technically nationalized before, but he asserted state control. So most of the profits from the oil went into the government budget. And in 2003, he announced that Venezuela was going to move toward what he called socialism of the 21st century. And they started bringing in Cuban doctors to the neighborhoods in Venezuela to provide free healthcare. And they brought in Cuban literacy volunteers to teach everyone how to read. And they wiped out illiteracy in the country. And they did all these dramatic reforms to improve people's lives, right? One thing in Venezuela is there's a lot of people in Venezuela that were blind because of poverty. And they brought in Cuban doctors to do laser eye surgery. And thousands of people got their eyesight because of the Bolivarian Revolution. Thousands of people got their ability to see because of Bolivarian socialism. They wiped out illiteracy in the country. They built 20 public universities. I mean, when he first came into office, they had only 12 public universities. By the time Hugo Chavez had died, they had 32 public universities. That's huge, right? Right? I mean, he did massive things to improve living conditions in Venezuela. And he started openly talking about moving the country towards socialism. And they used the state-run oil money to transition the country towards socialism. And that is an important aspect of what went on. We're told in the United States that Venezuela is starving because of socialism. They're all starving because in socialism, you just starve because that's what happens. When you have socialism, everyone starves. And that's not true. In fact, the New York Times or Wall Street Journal has an article talking about how in 2014, the party was still on and the government was spending money like crazy. It wasn't until the oil price drop of 2014. And it wasn't until, after Chavez died, you had a dramatic oil price drop. And things in the country really started to get worse because they import most of their food. Now, I just ripped Destiny to shreds over this point. And I'm going to show you this because anyone who tries to tell you, they're starving in Venezuela because of socialism, that's not true. And you can watch me, debate one of the slickest, most manipulative arguers on the internet on this point.
people don't blame Haiti for capitalism, but they do blame Venezuela, right? My understanding of Haiti is there are a lot of corruption problems that exist within that government. It's not literally just they tried capitalism and it's ruining the country. But then people do blame Venezuela. Well, that was because Venezuela, like, very specifically started to make socialist pivots in its economy. It started to nationalize more industries. It started to wait. Which part of that do you disagree? Do you disagree that they were expropriating industries? Do you disagree that they tried to hardcore set price control?
Ownership in Venezuela is actually much lower than the rate of state ownership in China. Other than
wait. How is that a response? No. You wouldn't compare the state.
Oil, very little is nationalized, and I've been to Venezuela, and one of the biggest problems they have is that their economy is entirely centered around oil. And when the oil price dropped in 2014, that caused a huge amount of scarcity. They need to have farms there. They need to have steel manufacturing there, and they don't have it. If they had state-run big steel mills and state-run farms and all of that, they'd be in a much better shape.
Okay. If you want to at a future debate, I would love to come back and talk about Venezuela, because I am positive that your assertions there, that it was just because oil collapsed, that's why that country fell apart, is absolutely not true. And that no person that has been involved.
Is a big problem as well.
No, not corruption. That it was very specifically. Okay, it was very specifically pivots towards trying to socialize or nationalize or expropriate parts of their economy to set incredibly restrictive price controls that caused capital industry to flee that country, that caused some firms to no longer produce goods or provide goods for its people. This is one of the large reasons why Venezuela fell. It's not just because oil prices fell a little bit. You don't see other OPEC countries.
Oil-producing country, a huge oil-producing country, bigger oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, than I've heard. The oil prices drop, and at the same time, they suddenly start having big economic problems, but it's unrelated. It's all just because they believe in socialism too much. That's what you're saying? Oil price drop of 2014 was dramatic. At that point, you could buy a family meal at Kentucky Fried Chicken that would cost more than a barrel of oil.
The petroleum sector accounts for roughly So I'm just looking this up. I'm looking this up on the fly because I know you're very incorrect. The petroleum sector accounts for roughly 87% of Saudi's budget reserves, 90% of the export earnings, and 42% of GDP. That's petroleum in Saudi Arabia. And Venezuela, oil is.
Saudi Arabia had big economic problems as well.
Saudi Arabia didn't have pictures of families eating rats off the street because their economy tanked so hard. I don't have people.
You're not allowed to.
From Saudi Arabia, crying that they're in
the country that are guest workers, slaves. Saudi Arabia, you couldn't take a picture like that, and Saudi Arabia has had big economic problems during that time.
Sure. Okay. So look, I'm very curious. I'm just curious.
Nigeria had problems. Oil-producing countries all suffered as a result.
Sure.
Of 2014
they did suffer.
Go ahead and let Destiny. Go ahead and get your point in.
The fact that Venezuela didn't.
Are you going to make the claim that Venezuela suffered just as much as every other OPEC country did when oil prices fell? Is that the claim that you want to make?
No.
So why
Venezuela also suffers from sanctions from the United States. Venezuela also has big problems with corruption, and they also have the problem that they don't have. You said that the problem was they already had steel manufacturing. They already had big farms. No, the problem is they don't have it. It's a one commodity economy.
Why is that relevant? Why does that matter? You don't need to produce every good that your society consumes.
If your entire economy is centered around oil, right, and you are importing all of your food and products, and then you get sanctions imposed on you, and yes, there are big problems there, and they've manifested themselves, and I think it's interesting, though. Now, you acknowledge, what I think is interesting about your Venezuela narrative is the narrative I normally get from people about Venezuela is that everyone has been poor and starving ever since they had socialism there, and that proves communism always fails. That's not the narrative that you have. You've admitted that there were economic successes there until a certain point. Now, why does the media lie? Why can't they admit what you just said? Why
I don't know. I'm not here to talk as a Fox News correspondent. I'm just curious why you think central planning is effective.
MSNBC or CNN. None of them can admit
MSNBC
there were big
or CNN
with their socialist economy until roughly about 2014.
Why am I getting real?
Let's not
extensively obscures. Why are you saying this and none of them are saying?
I don't think Destiny wants to. I don't think Destiny wants to speak for media companies.
I'm not here to.
I appreciate your honesty because everyone tells me all the time everyone's been starving ever since they moved towards socialism in Venezuela. You admit that the problems began fairly recently. Thank you.
Thank you
for your honesty. So we can agree anti-communists are liars. We can agree on that. That the anti-communist narrative that's promoted throughout U.S. society is based on deception and falsehood. Thank you for admitting that. I appreciate it.
I don't know if Destiny can
so I haven't
make that claim.
Anything.
Why is it necessary to lie, Destiny? Why don't they say what you just said? That would be
I don't think
Destiny can't speak for media companies. Destiny, go ahead and respond.
Because most of the people that were alive in the United States probably either have parents or grandparents that were involved in some crazy dumbass U.S. war against communism and the idea that like all commies are trying to destroy the world and blah 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 blah. And like that is a lie, and it's stupid. It's incredibly stupid. The way that Americans view, if you ask the average American what is socialism, the answer they would probably give you is stealing money from the rich and giving it to the poor.
Yep, I crushed him. I absolutely crushed him there. And that this narrative that Venezuela has just been starving ever since they had socialism, it doesn't add up. What happened was that the USA has tried to crush Venezuela's economy with sanctions, and they blatantly done that very openly. Their goal has been to crush Venezuela's economy with sanctions. And then in 2014, Saudi Arabia flooded the market with cheap oil, and there was a dramatic oil price drop. And when that oil price drop happened, Venezuela's state revenue dramatically decreased, and they had a very big problem importing certain consumer goods. And it was awful. And it was imposed by the United States, and it caused big problems in Venezuela. But their response to that has been to get friendlier to Iran and China and Russia. And now there's huge Iranian supermarkets in Venezuela. And now things in Venezuela have gotten much better. And that food crisis has come to an end because Iran and Venezuela have gotten much closer. And there's all kinds of Iranian products. And I mean, Venezuela has improved things. It's important to talk about the situation in Venezuela, right? Venezuela, at this point, they have an economy centered around state-run oil and the state-run oil industry. And they use the state-run oil money to stabilize their economy and to fund various businesses. And there is a network of communist worker cooperatives, they call colectivos, that they've set up in the country. There's a network of those that are subsidized. It's like worker-owned cement factories and, factories that make different products that are worker-owned. And it's funded by the socialist government. And they have a military. The actual military of Venezuela is trained in Cuba, and Marxist-Leninist anti-imperialist ideology is part of their military training. Plus, in addition to the regular military, they have these things called the Bolivarian militias that are community armed groups that are trained in how to use guns and firearms that are based in neighborhoods and are very well organized. So at this point, we have Venezuela. They have an anti-imperialist government with communists in the leadership. They have an alliance with all the anti-imperialist states, and they have a government that is very popular and has enacted very important reforms. Now, the USA has tried to wreck their economy very dramatically, but it hasn't been able to crush them. And the reason it hasn't been able to crush them and force them out of power is because so many people really benefited from what the socialist government has done. That they will fight for it to the end. If you go to Iran, if you go to Venezuela, you'll notice that countries like this tend to be a third, right? And I noticed this. In Venezuela, you got a third of the people that are against the government, right? You go to the rich neighborhoods, people there are against the government. They hate Maduro, they hate communism, right? They're pretty openly racist. They're all these brown people, these poor people up in the mountains, blah, blah, blah. You got a third of the people that are against the government. Then you got a third of the people that are, they're indifferent, right? The government's done some good stuff, but they have some problems too. But you got a third of the people that are like whatever. But then there's a third of the people in Venezuela, and Iran is like this too, that are fanatical supporters of Bolivarian socialism. The people who live in the colectivos, the people who live in the communes, the people who live in central Caracas, the people who live in these worker cooperative farms out in the countryside, those people are fanatical. And many of them are Christians and religious. And many of them, they model some of these communes that they've built, even though they're Christian, they model them on Hezbollah. And they model them on what Hezbollah has done in Lebanon. Very openly, they study what Lebanon has done. And they are ready to be martyrs, and they have their guns, and they are ready to die. They have big pictures of Stalin and big pictures of Mao, and these are poor people. These are indigenous folks largely, and they know that they would never have been able to read and write if it wasn't for socialism. They would never have had electrification in their neighborhood. They'd never have running water. And they are ready to go down fighting. They are ready to become martyrs for socialism. And those people, and that's why Maduro has never been overthrown, is that in order to bring down Maduro, you would have to go against those people. And there's a third of the country that is locked and loaded and ready to die, ready to die for communism, right? And it is not classic Marxist-Leninism. It is Christian communism. It is very religious. It is got indigenous traditions in it and indigenous, tribal stuff mixed in with it. And it's got classical ML mixed in with it. And some of them are Trotskyites and some of them are Maoists, and it's a lot of different stuff. And some of them are Pentecostals and some of them are doing indigenous, and it's very divided too. And there's many different factions that believe things in different ways, right? There are more classically communist ones. There's different parties. And this is what's interesting about Venezuela. So Maduro's the president, and Maduro was the leader of the bus drivers union. He's a huge man who was the head of the bus drivers union for many years. And then he ended up becoming the vice president of Hugo Chavez and became the successor of Hugo Chavez. And you have the official Communist Party of Venezuela, right? That was part of the coalition. Now, at this point, the Communist Party of Venezuela has split, and the genuine anti-imperialists are in the United Socialist Party, and the sectarians are in the Communist Party, and the Communist Party is taking a negative position at this point. But you also have, in Venezuela, you have the Homeland for All, or the Fatherland for All Party, which is a Marxist-Leninist communist party, but it's just it's a breakaway, right? It's like another communist party. It's the Homeland for All Party. You have the Movement Towards Socialism Party. In fact, what they call the Patriotic Pole in Venezuela has a number of different communist and socialist groups in it. I will read you the names. The Patriotic Pole is the coalition of different parties in the Bolivarian government of Venezuela. The main party is the United Socialist Party, the PSUV, right? But there's a number of different parties in the Patriotic Pole. There's the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. There's the Fatherland for All Party. There's the Tupamaro Party. That's like an indigenous party, right? But it's a Marxist-Leninist communist party that emphasizes the indigenous people's rights. There's a party called For Social Democracy. That is a social democratic party. There's the Republican Bicentennial Vanguard Party. I don't even know what they believe in, right? The Republican Bicentennial Vanguard Party. It's a socialist political party, right? There's the Popular Unity Party, which is it describes its ideology as anti-imperialist, right? I don't know what they are. They're the Popular Unity Party. There's the Alliance for Change, the People's Electoral Movement, the Organized Socialist Party of Venezuela, right? The movement We Are Venezuela, the Network Party, the Authentic Renewal Party, right? The Revolutionary Middle Class Party, the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Venezuela, right? And the Workers' Party of Venezuela. All of those parties are part of the Great Patriotic Pole, the ruling coalition in Venezuela, right? If you think about it, so all these different people with their different interpretations of communism and their different understandings, you got For Social Democracy, you've got Tupamaro, you've got Homeland for All, all these different kind of factions have united in supporting moving Venezuela towards socialism and opposing the imperialists. And I think that we should learn from Venezuela, because in our time, I'm just being honest with you, I think that coalitions like this, popular fronts like this, are going to be a big part of building socialism in our time. The Houthi movement, and I wrote this whole book about the Houthis and where they came from, right? I think the Houthis, you got to study the Houthi movement, the Houthi movement, right? It's a lot like the Bolivarian movement in Venezuela. It's actually modeled on the Bolivarian movement in Venezuela, even though they're Shia Muslims. And if you look at the Houthi movement, the Revolutionary Committee is a similar coalition. You have the Houthis that are Shia Muslims, but you've also got the old socialist communist ruling party of South Yemen. You've got various different groups, the feminist movement, etc. You've got various different groups that formed what they call the Revolutionary Committee, and that socialism, when it comes to the United States, I believe there's going to be an anti-monopoly coalition, and it'll be, there'll be a big division, right? And we need to look at it. This is how anti-imperialist governments kind of emerge in our time, right? There tends to be, an anti-monopoly coalition that emerges, etc. This is very, very important to talk about. This is very important to talk about. And we're going to talk about it. We should be open about the fact that this is going to happen. And I want to talk about that because of the fact that I just can't not point this out, right? And this has to be pointed out. Maduro supports Trump. Okay? Maduro supports Trump. And can we just acknowledge this? Like, there's no reason to pretend otherwise. Nicolas Maduro supports Trump. And if you don't want to believe that, which I'm sure a lot of the people don't want to believe that, right? But I will show you 2 clips of recent speeches from Nicolas Maduro where he makes it blatantly obvious that in the upcoming election in the United States, he sees Trump as the lesser of 2 evils. He sees Trump as the lesser of 2 evils. He's made that clear. I'm going to show you 2 clips where he says that, right? In this first clip, right? This first clip is more recent. And in this clip, pay attention to what Maduro says. This is him recently talking about the people claiming that he's not the legitimate winner of the election in Venezuela, trying to claim that he's somehow, he's a fraudulent leader, that he stole the election, right? This is Maduro.
Polo patriótico y el Partido Socialista Unido de Venezuela estamos listos para entregar todas las actas del 100% de mesas a la sala electoral cuando así lo requiera el contencioso electoral que se introdujo el día de hoy por mi persona. Diría un dicho popular venezolano, más claro no canta un gallo. Han querido convertir la elección de Venezuela en un evento mundial. ¿Cuántos gobiernos del mundo, señores de la Unión Europea, metiches de la Unión Europea, señores del Centro Carter, cuántos comunicados sacaron ustedes cuando Donald Trump denunció fraude en las elecciones donde nombraron presidente al presidente Biden? ¿Cuántos comunicados sacó la Unión Europea, el Centro Carter? ¿Cuántos gobiernos del mundo pidieron que se revisaran todas las mesas de votaciones de Estados Unidos? Díganme ustedes. El gobierno de Londres, el alto comisionado de derechos humanos. Y Trump se quedó con su grito de fraude. No se sabe si fue chicha o limonada en Estados Unidos. La potencia más poderosa del planeta, fraude, fue el grito. ¿Cuántas actas revisaron? ¿Cuál es la autoridad electoral en Estados Unidos? ¿Cuál? Hay un poder electoral, hay un CNE. ¿Quién organiza las elecciones? Las gobernaciones. ¿Y si en Venezuela lo organizaran a partir de hoy las alcaldías y se cambiara toda la ley? Grito al cielo.
So there we go, right? He's calling out the European Union and all these countries for not taking seriously Donald Trump's claim that the election was stolen from him in 2020. Now, that's a pretty bold statement to make, and it indicates, support for Trump. You wouldn't say that if you didn't support Trump. And this is another statement that he made. Again, people can choose to ignore this. I'm sure Ben Norton and Danny Haifong are ignoring this because it doesn't fit their narrative. This is Maduro's own words.
Ellos ponen una sonrisa de frente en su diplomacia por engaño, pero por detrás tienen el puñal. Y si les crees a su sonrisa, te descuidas, te volteas, te apuñalean. Así ellos han actuado casi 200 años, asesinando presidentes, asesinando líderes en el mundo, asesinando presidentes en Estados Unidos. John F. Kennedy. ¿Quién lo mató? El sistema. Comprobado. Crearon lo que hoy se conoce un falso positivo, con un tal señor de apellido Oswald. Eso es conocido. Bien denunciado en un documental película llamada JFK. Bastante documentado. Kennedy lo mata la mafia criminal de Miami y lo mata la CIA. Porque él pensaba y estaba trabajando por acabar la guerra de Vietnam y por entenderse con Cuba y cesar el bloqueo y la agresión contra Cuba. De hecho, se conoce que el mismo día que lo matan, a la misma hora que se sabe la noticia, un 22 de noviembre de 1963, Fidel Castro estaba en Varadero, en una casa protocolar, y estaba conversando con un enviado especial del presidente Kennedy. Y le estaba entregando 2 cajas de puros, de habanos, para que se lo llevara de regalo, porque al presidente Kennedy le gustaban los puros cubanos. Y en ese momento entró uno de los asistentes del presidente Fidel Castro, el comandante Fidel Castro, creo que era primer ministro para entonces, y le dio la infausta noticia. Prendieron el radio y se enteraron de las noticias. El mismo día, a la misma hora, estaba Fidel recibiendo un enviado especial para conversar un plan de regularización de las relaciones. El sistema lo asesinó. Tiene un largo historial de asesinatos, golpes de Estado en el mundo y mucho dinero de por medio. Recientemente condenamos el intento de asesinato del expresidente Donald Trump y hay muchas dudas de quienes protegían a Donald Trump, de que por qué permitieron a ese tirador pararse ahí. Hay muchas dudas que se han expresado en Estados Unidos. Ahora están tratando de tapar eso. Así que ese imperio acostumbrado a la violencia, a los golpes de Estado, preparó un escenario sobre Venezuela.
So now there he is saying that the same people that killed Kennedy and the same people that are trying to destabilize Venezuela right now are the same people that tried to kill Donald Trump. I mean, that's pretty blatant. Trump's enemies are also Maduro's enemies. That sounds like he's supporting Donald Trump. What we got, was his official response, when it was that Trump was shot at. He gave his official condolences.
Iba saliendo de Guanare, recibimos una noticia que en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica hubo un atentado contra el expresidente y candidato presidencial Donald Trump. Quiero a nombre de Venezuela entera, de nuestro pueblo, rechazar y repudiar el atentado contra el expresidente Donald Trump, desearle su pronta recuperación y que Dios bendiga al pueblo de los Estados Unidos y le dé la paz y le dé la tranquilidad. Hemos sido adversarios, pero le deseo al presidente Trump salud y larga vida. Y repudio ese atentado. Yo también fui víctima de un atentado. Y de 100 intentos de matarme. Pero siempre Dios puso su mano. Y aquí estamos, sanos, vivos y victoriosos, listos para verle la cara al futuro.
Now, for those of you, that one didn't have subtitles. What he said was, as I was leaving Ganare, we received news that the United States of America, there was an attack against former president and presidential candidate Donald Trump. I want, on our behalf of all Venezuela and our people, to repudiate the attack against former President Donald Trump. I wish him a speedy recovery, and God bless the people of the United States and give them peace and tranquility. We have been adversaries, but I wish Trump health and long life, and I repudiate this attack. I was also the victim of an attack and 100 attempts to kill me, but God always extended his hand, and we are healthy, alive, and victorious. Nicolas Maduro supports Donald Trump, right? So anybody who claims to support Venezuela and repeats the line that Trump supporters are Nazis or Trump is Hitler or, oh my God, we have to vote for Kamala Harris because they're just full of it. He says very blatantly that people that are trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela tried to kill Trump. He says very blatantly that he is sympathetic to Trump against the assassination. He highlighted Donald Trump's claims that the election in Venezuela was stolen, or in the United States was stolen. And he said, why were those claims not treated as legitimate? Maduro supports Donald Trump. That is very clear. He obviously is not meddling in American politics. He's obviously not trying to, rig our elections or anything like that. But it's pretty clear that he considers Donald Trump to be less of a threat to Venezuela than Kamala Harris. And that's because the people on the streets of Venezuela right now trying to overthrow him are from the same color revolution machine that Kamala Harris has been created by. And that's what I wrote my whole book about. Let me show you a picture of Kamala Harris's niece. Right? Kamala Harris has a niece. Her name is Mina Harris, right? And here is Kamala Harris with her niece. Right? Here we go. I will show you this. Right? Hold on. This is Kamala Harris with her niece, Mina Harris. Now, that's really great that Kamala and her niece can have such a great relationship. I am obviously not against people being close to their family. But what does Mina Harris do for a living? Mina Harris lives in India and runs NGOs trying to overthrow the government of Modi in India. She is a regime change, color revolution activist trying to destabilize one of the largest countries in the world. Right? Mina Harris lives in India. And because India is friendly to Russia, you can read all about it. Right? Mina Harris gets money from George Soros and gets money from the U.S. State Department to stage protests in India to try and overthrow the government of India. Just like people in Venezuela get money from the United States to try and overthrow the government of Venezuela, right? These are facts. Kamala Harris is a complete purchased product. She is a completely manufactured lock, stock, and barrel product of the color revolution George Soros apparatus. Donald Trump is a demagogue. Donald Trump is a populist demagogue who serves his own interest. Kamala Harris is just their puppet and their creation. The people on the streets of Venezuela right now and Mina Harris, Kamala Harris's niece, work in the same job with the same paymasters and the same employers. They get paid by the Rockefeller Foundations and the Ford Foundation and the U.S. Endowment for Democracy to destabilize countries. And so the people on the streets of Venezuela rioting right now and burning food warehouses and trying to prevent their people from eating because they want to bring down the government, the rich kids of Venezuela that hate Maduro, are being organized by the same group that employs Kamala Harris's niece, Mina Harris, and she does the same thing in India to try and bring down Modi. These are facts, folks. These are facts, right? These are facts. Kamala Harris, Mina Harris, the anti-Maduro protests are all the same thing. It's a family business. I'm telling you, that's why Maduro says, look, Trump was an awful president. Trump did bad things to Venezuela, but I've got a better shot with Trump than I've got with Kamala, because Trump eventually had a falling out with John Bolton, and Trump eventually got tired of trying to destabilize Venezuela. Whereas Mina Harris and Kamala Harris, they are regime change activists. They are part of the regime change lobby for a living. And that is what you need to understand. Okay? And that's what I would like you to understand. Maduro supports Donald Trump, or at least considers Donald Trump to be the lesser of two evils. And he's making that blatantly clear. So anyone who claims to be a friend of Venezuela, but also has Trump derangement syndrome, is a fraud, right? They're not listening to what Venezuela is actually saying, if that is the case, right? Because Venezuela is making it blatantly clear who they consider to be more of a threat to them. I just want to make that clear. I want to get that out of my system, because there's a lot of confusion about these kind of points. There's a lot of, deceptive actors out there that want to reframe the conversation and want to confuse you. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a big supporter of Maduro, and I'm not saying that Donald Trump might not do awful things to Venezuela if he becomes president. But I'm telling you, based on President Maduro's own calculations, they consider Kamala Harris to be a greater threat than Donald Trump. These are facts. So what the Communist Party USA is doing right now, and what is being said by the Workers' World Party, and what's being said by Brian Becker and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, does not match what Venezuela is saying. That's because these groups don't work for Venezuela, and they don't work for the global anti-imperialist movement. They work for the CIA, right? They got their foundation money to get their fancy offices and to run their liberal woke protests, and they are doing the exact opposite. North Korea is also saying that if negotiations start up again, that negotiations can start up again with Trump in office, right? It is blatantly obvious that the global anti-imperialist movement sees Donald Trump as the lesser of two evils right now. And there's a huge amount of effort to hide that from you, right? On the one hand, you have the Trump people that accuse the woke people of being communists and want you to think that China and woke are the same thing, or Venezuela and woke are the same thing, and they're lying. And you have the fake left that are trying to equate what they're doing in supporting the Democrats with what the anti-imperialist countries are doing, and they are also lying. We are being lied to by both sides. The neocon wing of the Trump camp is trying to equate overthrowing Venezuela with, supporting Trump in the United States. And the woke left is also trying to equate, being a communist with being having Trump derangement syndrome, etc. There is a lot of layers of deception going on here, but it is very, very clear that at this point, the global anti-imperialist movement considers Trump to be the lesser of two evils. Iran, maybe not. Iran is in a little bit of a unique position. China, maybe not. But outside of China and outside of Iran, it's pretty universal that Kamala Harris is a bigger threat. I'm just pointing this out. These are facts. And the fact that certain people are not telling you this, are going out of their way to obscure this, should tell you everything you need to know about them. So there we go. All right, folks, names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Who's with us? All right. Names and locations, right? Do not ask me. Somebody asked me a question earlier. I don't want to hear it. Please stop. All right. Jamie in Boise, Idaho, Auckland, New Zealand, Mark Jones in Utica, New York, John McCarthy in Chicago, St. David's in Bermuda, Harold Dogbottom in Kakalaki, First Amendment in Detroit, Kieran in London, Seasoned Noob, Pacifica, Ryan in Kansas City, JT24, Doc Green for Peace, Rachel Winder in Georgia, El Salvador, Ed in Louisville, Bob in Troy, New York, Matthew in Louisiana, Mariah in North Carolina, Hugo in the Netherlands, Mr. Ricks in Arizona, Joe in Raleigh, North Carolina, Sydney, Australia, Anthony David, Denver in Colorado, John Whitty in Houston, Richard in the United Kingdom, Grange over Sands, Emperor Penguin in Texas, Patrick in Maine, Briggy out in Pennsylvania. Welcome. So glad to have you with us. Names and locations: St. Joseph, Missouri, USA. Very, very good. Very, very good. Glad to have you with us. Greg in Newcastle, Isaac in Vancouver, Colin in Greensboro. Welcome. Glad to have you with us. Oh boy, folks. I am going on a road trip this week. And I'm going to be able to see my Chicago comrades, and I'm looking forward to it. Wednesday, I'll be in Chicago, and I'll be back in New York pretty quick after. Gabby in Chicago. It's going to be good, and I'm going to be delivering some important books and getting some important work done. Look, we do it in CPI. We do it, right? This book needed to be printed a long time ago, and we printed it for the Libertarian Party convention. It was a big hit. We printed 1,000 more of them, and people are going to get a copy of it, right? We didn't have to ask anyone's permission to print it. We just did it, right? And that's, we got the Kamala book. Again, I didn't have to ask the Central Committee of the party secretariat to write my book on Kamala Harris. I just wrote it, and look what it's doing now, right? I mean, we are getting it done. We are getting it done, folks. We are getting it done, right? Oh, Phil. Yes, Phil in Brooklyn. Good to have you, Phil. Good to have you. Good to have you. Wild times. I think I am going to put on some Irish music before I start answering people's super chats. Because I like Irish music. I do. And this is an Irish song that apparently goes back really far. It's in Gaelic. And it goes back to the Roman Empire when the Celts were fighting the Roman Empire. And it's like welcoming home warriors. It's like welcome home warriors, like you're welcoming home warriors from battle. It's a really powerful old Irish song. So I'm going to put this one on. We'll play some Irish music. If you got any more super chats, great. But here we go.
Ole arma le margarda, Gary Hames, Gana,
So yeah, I will put a version on that has a translation of the lyrics underneath it. Right. Because this is, it's like Welcome Home Warriors. It's a very popular Irish rebel song. So very old. So here's a version, someone playing it on the piano, and it has the lyrics translated below hand. All righty. I also wanted to play another Irish song, which is a favorite of mine. I've recited the lyrics many times at events, because it's about the immigrant experience. It's about land seizures. It's about austerity. It's about, being driven off your land and fleeing to another country. It's an Irish song about, fleeing to the United States. And it's very poetic. And so this is a version of it. You can find many different versions of it online. So yeah, I will put this on as well. Skibbereen.
Oh, Father dear, I oft times hear you speak of Erin's Isle. Her lofty scenes, her valleys green, her mountains rude and wild. They say it is a lovely land wherein a prince might dwell. So why did you abandon it? The reason to me tell. Oh son, I loved my native land with energy and pride, till a blight came over all my crops, my sheep, my cattle died. My rent and taxes went unpaid, I could not them redeem, and that's the cruel reason why I left old Skibbereen. And well do I remember, son, that bleak December day. The landlord and the sheriff came to drive us all away. They set my cottage roof on fire with their cursed English spleen. I heaved a sigh and bade goodbye to dear old Skibbereen. Your mother, to God rest her soul, fell on the stony ground. She fainted in her anguish, seeing desolation round. She never rose but passed away from life to immortal dream, and found a quiet grave, me boy, in dear old Skibbereen. And you were only 2 years old, and feeble was your frame. I could not leave you with my friends, for you bore your father's name. I wrapped you in my coat armour in the dead of night unseen. I heaved a sigh and bade goodbye to dear old Skibbereen. It's well I do remember the year of 48, when I arose with Erin's boys to fight against our fate. I was hunted through the mountains for a traitor to the Queen, and that's another reason why I left old Skibbereen. Oh, father dear, the day will come when in answer to the call, all Irish men of freedom stern will rally one and all. I'll be the man to lead the band beneath the flag of green, and loud and high will raise the cry, revenge for Skibbereen.
All righty. So yeah. So now I'm going to start answering people's super chat questions. But you know, if you got any more questions, keep them rolling in. Have you seen the news about the stock market crash in South Korea? I have, and I have a lot of questions about it. I'm going to have to do some research, but I don't know if you saw, there was a figure, who's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and she worked in the Obama White House and in the Bush White House, and she's been charged with being a foreign agent of South Korea. And I don't know if you saw this. This is wild. I mean, this woman is not an anti-imperialist. They're using the same law that they went after the Uhuru movement with, the FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And they have charged this woman, who is like a very well-respected academic, Sue May Terry, of being an agent of South Korea, not of North Korea, but of South Korea. And this is very interesting. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, this is some retaliation. There's something going on between the USA and South Korea right now. The USA is trying to punish South Korea. And it may be that South Korea is just not going to cooperate with the U.S. escalations against North Korea in the way that the United States wants. Because you will recall that in the past, in the 1990s, there was the crash on the Asian markets, which was later proven to be coordinated by the United States. It was retaliation for the independence of the Asian tiger countries. And it was retaliation. And the other thing is that, there is escalation going on the Korean Peninsula right now, but public opinion, and in the Korean Peninsula, in South Korea even, is against war. They don't want war. They were very happy with things going on. And so it looks to me like this may not just be the natural market cycle. It looks to me like this could be U.S. retaliation. It could be that a lot of U.S. money was pulled out very quickly. We shall see. But the prosecution of Sume Terry makes absolutely no sense because she is not an anti-imperialist. She is not pro-North Korea. She's just somebody who's just a prominent Korean American who worked in the administration of Obama and of Bush. And she's just a prominent Korean American official. And the fact that they're prosecuting her, and I mean, the charge against her, if you read the details of it, it's so ridiculous, right? They're claiming that she was given some luxury handbags. You can't make this up. She was given some luxury handbags, and she was taken out to dinner at some nice sushi restaurants in exchange for writing articles that were sympathetic to South Korea. I mean, that's so ridiculous. I mean, that is not, I'm sorry. Geez, I better be careful the next time I go out with a friend and they like an article I wrote about Russia. I better be careful because they'll say that they bought me dinner because, this is so stupid. It's so stupid. And I doubt it'll hold up in court, but we shall see. And that shows you how dangerous the Uhuru case is. Yeah, exactly. That's one hell of a sushi meal, right? That they're saying that her sushi meal is a FARA violation. That is so fucking ridiculous, right? It's just a joke, but it shows, what's SMDH, right? What does that stand for? But anyway, it's ridiculous. You read the details, but it sounds like they see her as an asset of South Korea, that she's tied to the South Korean government to some degree, and they're retaliating against that. And it sounds like it's because South Korea won't do what they say. So the fact that South Korea's, stock market just crashed, it makes me suspicious. Shaking my damn head. Got it. Okay. She's accused of being enthusiastically pro-South Korea and being an agent of South Korea because she wrote articles. The whole thing is so ridiculous. She's literally a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is one of their people. This is somebody who served in the Obama White House and served in the Bush White House. And she's like one of their top strategists, and she's just a Korea expert who's a Korean American. And they're claiming that they bought her some luxury handbags and took her out to dinner. So she's a foreign lobbyist of South Korea. Got to get the Prada bag, sis. Yeah. And Israel, of course, AIPAC can do whatever they want, right? If a luxury handbag and a sushi dinner it makes you a foreign agent. Like, how many Israeli agents do we have in our government that get all kinds of perks? This is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous, right? I'll write a friendly article for all I can eat sushi. Exactly, right? Who doesn't love a good California roll, right? This is ridiculous. It's just absolutely ridiculous, and it makes me think that something's going on, right? And I think that there's a lot of people in the South Korean deep state that are just like, China can give us a better deal. We'd rather not have war and have all our people die. China is a good friend of ours. Russia is a little bit closer. They've never done anything to us. I think I think that there's probably a lot of people in the South Korean government that, as the United States is putting nukes in South Korea, nuclear submarines, and doing all of that, I think there's a lot of people that are just saying no. And I think that the U.S. deep state is retaliating against South Korea right now. That's what this has to be. So that's what I think of when I look at the stock market crash in South Korea. We'll know the details soon, but it looks to me like this is very much manufactured. So there we go. All right. I am disturbed by so many commentators in the U.S. and the U.K. who describe the Democrats and the Labor Party as communist and socialist without understanding that they are not. It's a problem, and it is a problem, Kiwi Dave. It is a big problem. And I mean, it is a problem, but at the same time, we have to. I'm at the point where I am not interested in trying to own the communism label at this point because I don't have that kind of power, right? In theory, yes, we could go and take back communism from woke people. We could go and take back, but we don't have that kind of power, right? The majority of the people in Western countries who talk in the name of communism have absolutely nothing to do with what genuine communist countries are doing, and they'll tell you that. And I've noticed, it's weird, but there's this group called Revolutionary Communists of America, RCA, and they are a rebrand of the International Marxist Tendency. They're Trotskyites, and they are in your face with red flags talking about communism. And you talk to them, they are Trotskyites. They hate Vietnam and China and Venezuela. They hate all the genuine communist countries. They're just a bunch of trots, but they're everywhere and they're very visible with the red flags. All of a sudden, I see their posters in New York City and stuff. Something's going on, folks. Something's going on. And, just be very, very careful. That's all I can say. Be very, very careful, because right now we know Trumpers are being incited to believe that Joe Biden's a communist, that Kamala Harris is a communist. Be very, very careful of anyone who's trying to lure you into some kind of honeypot where you are owning the communist label. Be very careful of it, right? There's some weird things going on right now. There's some weird shit going on right now. I just got to tell you, and be very, very careful right now, right? Because I'm at the point where, I've realized that, yes, I mean, if you study Center for Political Innovation, what we believe in, I would say we have the most accurate interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. But that said, there are things of ML that we don't take. I mean, I'm not a dialectical materialist. I believe in God. I don't believe that change comes through only confrontation and only struggle, right? I am at the point where I have always been somewhat critical of dialectical materialism, but I'm at the point where I think that the notion that change only comes through conflict and that dialectical materialism defines reality is wrong. And it's wrong in a couple of ways. First of all, I do believe that spiritual forces exist. How do you get Che Guevara? How do you get Dr. Martin Luther King? How do you get somebody who goes and sacrifices for what they believe is right? How do you get that? Where does that come from? Right? Where does that come from? Right? If everything is just material, I believe, the way that people do heroic things is through spiritual forces. I mean, that people act against their own economic interest to do what is right. So there's that. And the other thing is that conflict is a big part of how history moves forward, no doubt about it. But conflict isn't everything, right? A classic example is the solar system. Dialectical materialism would look at our solar system, right? And it would say, wow, it's a big conflict. The gravity of the sun and the gravity of the earth are pulling against each other, and it's causing the earth to rotate against the sun. It's all a big battle. Well, that's true, but it's also true that it's order. It's not conflict, right? The gravity kind of makes it work. It's not just a big battle. It's conflict. It's not just conflict. It's also order, right? It's conflict, but it fits. Like the conflict has created an order. The reason that the earth rotates around the sun is not because, the sun and the earth are at war with each other. They kind of are. Their gravity is pulling against each other, but it also kind of fits, right? And if it was just a big battle, eventually, the earth would pull away from the sun, right? And I would also say that, sex is a great example. You look at the Sex Act, right? When two human beings procreate with one another, when two human beings engage in sexual intercourse, right? I mean, is that a conflict? Well, technically, I mean, there is tension, right? There are body parts that are pressing against each other. Male and female contradict each other. So you could say that the sex act is conflict. But if sex is as it's meant to be, it's supposed to be something that unifies two people with each other. It's supposed to be something that brings two people together. It's not supposed to be a fight, right? And if sex is forced and is violent, that's a very ugly thing we call rape. So, if you look at the sex act and you just say, oh, everything's a contradiction, which is how dialectical materialists look at it. They say, well, sex is a confrontation. No, it's not. There's a confrontational aspect of it, right? Confrontation is an aspect of reality, no doubt about it. But it doesn't define reality. There are still relationships, right? There is still give and take action between object and subject, and that the dialectical method that views everything as a confrontation, it leads to a mindset where it just burns people out, right? And I mean, if you see old communists, you will see that people that are it just burns them out. If there is no God and there's no real right and wrong, everything's just material. And then the only way to change things is to go head to head and fight. Eventually that's going to destroy you psychologically, right? You need there to be subject-object relationships. You need there to be give and take action. You need there to be spiritual forces and higher purposes. And everything is not dialect. Everything is not a confrontation, and everything is not material. There are non-material factors that go into everything. So, I think that the dialectical materialist philosophy is not correct. And I'm open about that at this point. Right. But I don't think, that, if you look at what Venezuela is doing, I think most of the people there would agree with me. Maduro is a Christian, the socialist collectivos that I visited were very Christian, very religious. So, that doesn't stop them in any way. And I know a lot of communists in America that call themselves dialectical materialists, but support U.S. imperialism and don't stand with any country. So I'm telling you that, I am at the point where I am not interested in claiming the lineage of communism. I am not interested in standing here and saying, I am the true inheritor of Karl Marx. I'm not, right? Marx was an atheist. Marx's philosophy was dialectical materialism. I have broken with that, right? Marx thought communism would come in the first world first. He didn't predict the rise of imperialism. Lenin rescued Marx in a lot of ways with his theory of imperialism and his writings on the national question. And that I am an advocate of socialism. I am an anti-imperialist. I believe in historical progress, which I believe is essential. I take from Marxism that which is good. The understanding of human progress, the struggle to reach a higher mode of production, the understanding of the inherent problems of the capitalist system, overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit, imperialism being the main enemy of humanity, the struggle to build socialism, and socialism giving way to the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world of vast abundance. I take the good from communism, but I can leave the bad. I can leave dialectical materialism. I don't think dialectical materialism is good. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's damaging psychologically. I think seeing the world that way hurts people psychologically. It burns them out. It makes them bitter. And I look at the communist groups that I've been around, and I look at the people that I've known who have spent their whole life doing dialectical materialism. And I look at even young communists who just discovered this, and the way they act and the way they treat each other, and the way their organizations develop, and the cyberbullying and all of that. And I say, look, this is dialectical materialism, right? Right there. I mean, this is what this leads to. And, I see that philosophy, that atheistic, conflict obsessed, destructive philosophy as something that the global communist movement rightly needs to break from. And I think most of the global communist movement has broken with dialectical materialism, right? I mean, Zhuganov, the leader of the Russian Communist Party, is an Orthodox Christian, and that the dialectical materialist philosophy, it damages people. I think it does damage to the world, and it has damaged individuals, and that I'm willing to admit that, right? So, I mean, does that make me not a pure Marxist? Do I care if I'm a pure Marxist or not? I am, and that's one thing. I really have no interest in arguing with anyone about whether or not I'm as pure a Marxist as they are. I don't care about that. I care about what's true. I care about changing the world for the better. And if Marx were around today, he would revise some stuff, right? And that orthodoxy, we need to get beyond the struggle for orthodoxy. And I talk about this in the new textbook, right? In the new textbook. And before I continue, I had some caffeine earlier, and it's going to be a long night. I probably am going to be on here for quite a while tonight. I've got a lot of energy, and who knows how early I'll have to get up for work tomorrow, but I'm going to read to you from the new textbook, because the new text. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Is my audio coming? Sorry, I had to my textbook was under the computer, so I had to lower the computer to get the textbook out. Can you hear me now? Audio good. Can you hear me? All right. This is the new textbook. And this is a masterpiece, right? Chapter 1 is on the Communist Party. Chapter 2 is on the global class war tendency and Sam Marcy. Chapter 3 is on the new communist movement of the 70s. Chapter 4 is on divisions in the ruling class. And chapter 5 is called Where Do We Go From Here? And it's about, the perspective through which we're building the Center for Political Innovation. And this textbook has original texts to go with everything in it, right? We have text from Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, text from Eugene Debs, text from William Z. Foster, campaign speeches. We have texts from the new communist movement. It has original texts in it, right? It's a huge book, but it's a masterpiece. I mean, you will really learn a lot about anti-imperialism and anti-imperialist organizing in America and what has been achieved before and what a successful organization could be like. So I am going to start reading to you from chapter 5, right? And if anyone has any more super chats, I will answer them before the end of tonight's stream. But I'm going to read to you a little bit, just a small section of chapter 5 that actually relates to what I'm talking about right now. Because this is something that if you're getting into these ideas, you need to understand this, right? Chapter 5 is part 5 is the city building tendency. It's about CPI. I'm just going to read you the first section of chapter 5. So where do we go from here? The global system of monopoly capitalism or imperialism still rules the world, but it is in a prolonged crisis spawned by the computer revolution. A block of resistance exists around the world, a block that emerged as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution, but has been corrected and adjusted in many ways to account for the shortcomings and setbacks of the 20th century. The entrepreneurial lower levels of capital are in an all-out fight against the managerial ultra-rich who are struggling to contain the crisis and resolve it by imposing degrowth and tightly controlled capitalism. This book was not written for those who are simply content to analyze the situation, but rather for those who want to act. So how do we act? What can we learn from the previous history of anti-imperialist movements in the United States? To begin with, we must abandon dogmatism. In the history of the new communist movement of the 70s, Max Elbaum writes in his conclusion about a misdirected quest for orthodoxy. Elbaum explains that the new communist movement activists looked to inspiration from China, and while some shifted to supporting Cuba or the Soviet Union as the years went on, as China's politics changed, he wrote, advocates of all these perspectives accepted the notion that there was one single revolutionary tradition and that there existed a single genuine Marxism-Leninism that embodied all its accounted wisdom. They believed upholding their favored version of Marxism-Leninism was key to building a revolutionary movement. This established a never-ending quest for orthodoxy and a constant suspicion of heresy at the very center of the movement's outlook. Even when activists learned through bitter experience that a particular system of orthodoxy was fundamentally flawed, impulses to break with dogmatism and explore new theoretical terrain were overwhelmed by the push to find yet another orthodoxy. Right. Elbaum seems to be pointing to an obvious unspoken reality of the global anti-imperialist movement. Modern anti-imperialist states and mass movements globally, while summing up the experiences and upholding the achievements of previous movements and leaders, do not consider themselves inheritors of a pure line. Bolivarianism does not claim the pure lineage of Marxism. China's socialism with Chinese characteristics admits that it deviates from many of the ideas Mao Zedong put forward. Cuba openly criticizes Che Guevara and even Fidel Castro while figuring out how to continue efforts to build a more prosperous socialist society and stand against imperialism. The axis of resistance in the Middle East tends to be led by religious forces, and while it celebrates the achievements of anti-colonial fighters who were Marxist-Leninists, it absolutely does not claim to be the inheritors of some pure ideological line from them. Fighters in Donbass carry flags with hammers and sickles alongside Orthodox Christian icons and Tsarist emblems, and seeing all of it as Russia's unique cultural heritage and a society flourishing outside of Western hegemony. The days of Moscow calling itself the Party of Lenin and China accusing it of being revisionists who betrayed the pure line of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin are long over. The politics of anti-imperialism in our time are eclectic. They are a mishmash of concepts that inspire people to come together and resist, and they are formed on a pragmatic basis to serve the specific needs of the society and the people being mobilized against imperialism. They point to certain indisputable realities and objective truths, but they also draw from a diverse array of sources for inspiration and passion. However, those who call themselves communists in the West are increasingly disconnected from those who are actually fighting imperialism around the world. Part of their reason for being disconnected is that while the forces of resistance internationally have broken with orthodoxy, the isolated sects in the West that trace their roots to the Cold War era, communist organizations, see themselves as the inheritors of some kind of sacred Marxist tradition. The Communist Party, in its years of strength, always understood that socialism in America would not represent the adoption of a foreign ideology. However, after the Communist Party was smashed during the 1950s, this bit of wisdom and understanding was forgotten. Various communist sects all sought to claim the franchise of Moscow, Beijing, or Tirana. Some even tried to claim the lineage of dead figures like Trotsky or Luxemburg and contrast them with the existing global socialist movement. Like wealthy ancient Roman Stoics disappointed with the hedonism of life in the capital of the known world, middle-class intellectuals sought out exotic foreign gods they could worship. If Uncle Sam was a fraud, they could bow before Mao or Kim or Fidel and chant their mantras in the hopes of finding truth and a sense of fulfillment. This is a fundamentally flawed approach, and it cannot be the basis of building a successful mass movement. When advocates of socialism and anti-imperialism adopt a dogmatic approach, they are setting up an intellectual house of cards. One of the most widely circulated CIA anti-communist books was called The God That Failed. It contained essays by ex-communists, such as Arthur Koestler and Richard Wright. They all described believing Marxism-Leninism to be a flawless ideology and the Soviet Union to be a stronghold of hope, reason, and progress. Their disenchantment came by simply discovering the very real flaws that existed. The Khrushchev revelations devastated so many people in the global communist movement because they had not prepared themselves intellectually by understanding the Soviet Union's shortcomings and internal contradictions. If communism becomes your God, it can very easily become the God that failed. But the contemporary anti-imperialist bloc has learned this lesson. For them, socialism and anti-imperialism are a tool. They provide a way of understanding the world and point to real truths. Socialism is a method for building up the economy and raising people out of poverty. The history of communism and socialism provide real evidence, provide real tactical lessons about how to engage the masses of people in a struggle for justice, but they do not demand total conformity and intellectual submission. The reason that our organization is called the Center for Political Innovation is because we are attempting to bring the pragmatism and innovative thinking of the global anti-imperialist movement to the United States. We do not claim that if Karl Marx was alive today, he would be a member of our organization and no other. We do not claim this of Lenin or any other historical figure. We do not see ourselves as the holders of the one true line passed down over the course of hundreds of years, and we do not see ourselves as necessarily being revisionists or heretics because they do not join us. Our criticism of other forces is based on their failure to achieve the stated goal of creating a socialist society and their failure to make progress toward that end. Our approach is to study all revolutionary anti-imperialist movements, domestically and internationally, while blindly following none of them. We seek to study them all with the perspective of learning from them and cultivating a unique set of beliefs and tactics that can be applied to our specific situation here in the United States at this time. In essence, we seek to win. We want an America beyond imperialism. We want a movement that has a real base among the population and can wield real influence in society. Does this require that we tear down doing this requires that we tear down intellectual barriers that would prevent us from acquiring the needed knowledge and skills from available sources. We want to learn. Learning requires an open mind and an attachment to actually existing social forces. So, with our anti-imperialist mission, with our experience organizing in our time and our study of various anti-imperialist movements, how do we proceed? And that is from the final chapter of Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America, which is our textbook, which has a lot of original content, original, source material, speeches by Debs and William Z. Foster and others. It's really powerful stuff that it's in there. And I'm really glad we put it out there. So, all right. There we go. All right. How would you explain the situation in Venezuela to regular people? Well, I would say Venezuela has done amazing things. They've wiped out illiteracy. They've provided health care for the people. They've provided education to the people. They have lifted a whole lot of people out of poverty. And the USA has been trying to destroy that country as a result. And they've been trying to block their ability to import food. And they've been trying to overthrow the government. And they've sent the George Soros color revolution people there to cause rioting. And so the same people that are trying to fuck over Venezuela and prevent them from raising their people out of poverty are the same people that are flooding our communities with opioids, the same people that are building a prison state here in America, the same people that are driving inflation and destroying our living standards. So our real enemy is not in Venezuela. Our real enemy is at home. Our real enemy is the Wall Street bankers and monopolists. And Venezuela is our friend and our ally in struggling against imperialism and struggling against the big monopolies and bankers that run this country. And that we should learn from how Venezuela kicked Wall Street out of their country. We should learn from that because we should do the same thing here. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Venezuela has that already, and we can learn from it. And they've started out from a very low level of development, but they've accomplished a lot by getting rid of the rule of Wall Street and taking control of their oil and their natural gas and their natural resources. And that's what we should do here. Our oil should be public property. All righty. All right. Great article on the CPI website. John McCarthy spun on a dime, and he wrote a very, very good article on the CPI website about how Maduro's enemies are America's enemies. Very powerful, because we need to get this message to Trumpers right now. They're trying to get Trump to equate, opposing Venezuela with being a Trumper. And that's false. Maduro is saying the exact opposite. Go and read the great article that John McCarthy wrote, very short and to the point. He wrote it, and we're hoping that we can do some solidarity with Venezuela soon, because we need to support them right now as loudly as we possibly can, because there's a lot of lies going on. They're trying to destabilize it, and we need to stand with Venezuela and stand against the imperialists and learn from their anti-colonial revolution, their anti-imperialist revolution. Why are they sending Venezuelans to the USA, and particularly to Democrat states? These are the right-wing Venezuelans who hate Maduro, and they're bringing them to the United States because they're against the government, and they're being used by the Republicans, because Republicans have ties to the far-right organizations that are trying to overthrow Maduro, and they're using them. They're sending them to Democrat areas to cause problems, right? And it's a tactic, right? Because the Republicans are saying that they're tough on the border, that they're tough on the border, that they're tough on immigration, and the right-wing Venezuelans support the Republicans. So the Republicans are bringing the right-wing Venezuelans to the United States and sending them to liberal cities to cause problems and show that immigrants are a problem and that we need Trump to be president. It's all very stupid, honestly. It's very, very stupid. I don't know what to say about it, right? I think my position on immigration, first of all, is that we need a blanket amnesty for all the undocumented people in the United States right now. There's no way that you can deport the undocumented community. You can't do it, right? I mean, there are millions of undocumented people in the United States right now, and that terrorizing immigrant communities helps the gangs. It helps, for example, it helps the it helps MS-13, because immigrant communities are afraid to call the police. And it helps the issue with the wages, because, yes, immigrant workers are paid less than minimum wage, but that's illegal. And it doesn't matter if somebody has papers or not. It is illegal to pay someone less than minimum wage, but immigrant workers aren't going to speak up if they're afraid of getting deported, right? And so forcing immigrants into the shadows only makes the issue of undercutting labor worse. Forcing immigrants into the shadows only makes the gangs and MS-13 worse. Building a huge giant wall only makes it so people are more reliant on the smuggling gangs and the coyotes and all of that to get into the country. So everything that Republicans want to do to address the border crisis makes things worse. That said, the Democrats just want to pretend there's no problem. There is a big problem at the border. There is a big problem. And the fact that they find dead bodies along the border every day, the fact that so many people can't live in their own country because of the drug cartels, what's been going on in Arizona. And I mean, anyone who goes to New Mexico or Arizona or Texas and lives near the border will tell you there are big problems. And the Democrats, they just want to go, oh, it's all fine. It's the American dream. No, it's fucking not. It's a nightmare what these people are going through. There's a humanitarian crisis, and the only solution is economic development. We need the United States and Mexico and Nicaragua to come together and launch economic development. There needs to be an economic development corridor. That's what needs to happen. And there needs to be jobs and education and economic opportunity in Mexico and in Central America, so that these people can live in their homes and not get involved in the drug cartel organizations and not get involved in criminal stuff and not have to flee. We need economic development. The solution to the crisis of mass migration is economic development. What China has done with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, right, is the solution to the crisis of mass migration, right? If we had, if what China's done with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, just a corridor of development, electrification, jobs, healthcare, and all of that, people would stay in their country. There wouldn't be drug gangs. There wouldn't be a problem, right? And so that's my position, right, is that we should fight the drug gangs with jobs. We should fight the drug gangs with electricity and with schools and with hospitals and with development. The solution is development. The fake left opposes development because they think growth is bad and they think it's bad for the environment. They are anti-growth. And the right wing thinks that we can solve the problem with heavy-handed police state repression, which is not going to work. It's actually going to make all the problems worse, right? So, yes, the solution to the crisis of mass migration is economic development. There we go. All righty. Thoughts on the UK riots? Well, I spoke on this a little bit last night, but, I actually watched a very interesting interview today. Syrian girl, she has a YouTube channel, and she interviewed, of all people, Nick Griffin. And Nick Griffin is far-rightist, I guess, far-right nationalist. He was the leader of the British National Party, the BNP, that had a seat, he had a seat in the European Parliament. He's a far-right dude. But he talked about how the movement against mass migration in Britain has been taken over by Zionists. Right. And he talked about how, Tommy Robinson, this ignorant fuckhead who runs the anti-immigrant movement in Britain, is just a shill of Israel. And his whole thing is just hating Muslims. And rather than talking about globalism and that the actual BNP, the nationalists, right, they're far right, they're whatever. And we obviously don't endorse the BNP, but they're ideological nationalists. But Tommy Robinson is just an anti-Islamic bigot who hates Muslims and does propaganda for the British, for Zionism, and just demonizes Muslims. And everyone's pointing out that this event that happened, there was a brutal murder that happened where an immigrant man brutally murdered some people. And out of the blue, it blew up all over social media. How convenient. It blew up all over social media that the murderer was a Muslim, was an Arab. Well, it turns out that the perpetrator was a Christian, not a Muslim. And it also looks like the rioting was being promoted by social media. Now, they're calling for very blatant, heavy-handed repression. And, there's been a lot of heroism by a lot of working class people in Britain who don't want this rioting. Right. Who don't want this rioting. And they don't want this rioting to happen. And they don't want ethnic bigotry, and they don't want hatred of Muslims. Right. And you can talk about the crisis of mass migration without demonizing one particular religion. And that seems to be what is going on. Is that they're demonizing one particular religion. I don't know what more to say about it. So there we go. So, and that look, a lot of these far right people are just Zionists, hating Muslims. This idea of like Islam's an evil religion. I've read the Quran. That's just Zionist propaganda. That is just Zionist propaganda. And that I have met a number of people who've fallen into that nonsense. Well, I've read the Quran. I know what the Quran actually says. Well, I've read the Bible. I've read where it says you shouldn't have shellfish. And it says disrespectful children should be stoned to death. And, and if a woman is found to not be a virgin on the night she's married, she gets stoned to death and all of that. And obviously most Christians don't believe that. Most Christians see that as the Old Testament law that no longer applies. Well, there are many Muslims who there are certain things in the Quran that they don't accept and they don't believe. Right. And the notion that no, all Muslims really believe this, it's secret. I am blown away by how stupid that is. The anti-Islamic current of like, well, I know what Muslims really believe. And if a Muslim says they don't believe something, they're practicing taqiyya. They actually, it's so annoying. It requires a huge leap of faith. I mean, it's like they are just so determined to hate, and conveniently hate the same people that Israel hates. And then, I mean, I don't know. I could keep going on about this, but I have dealt with, this strand of, I don't know what you want to call it. So yeah. And then Elon Musk just tweeted the need for a civil war. Very suspicious. Elon Musk is playing a negative role right now, right? I mean, Maduro is openly saying Trump is better. He's saying the people who went after him are the people that went after Trump. But Elon Musk is the biggest supporter of trying to destabilize Venezuela. It looks like Elon Musk is the one driving the coup attempt in Venezuela. And now he's calling for civil war. And I mean, Elon Musk is not playing a good role right now. I was hoping that Elon Musk could be some kind of, more positive figure or something. But, I mean, he did the Twitter files. It's great that he leaked the Twitter files. That was good. But he never said that Twitter was stopping. And that was the weirdest thing about the Twitter files. He revealed that Twitter was doing all this political meddling, but at no point was there any, and now we won't, And in fact, he was then tweeting out about how much he loved the FBI at the same time. So it sounds like, while he revealed that Twitter was engaging in political meddling, he continued doing it. So I'm not thrilled. So yeah, Elon Musk, and that this whole event, it's very staged. Social media is rigged, right? And they used social media to create a riot, and now they're using that to have a woke blowback against the riot. I mean, there's manipulation going on, folks, right? This is FBI versus FBI. This is MI5 versus MI5. And that's what I see that whole incident as being, and that hating Muslims on the basis of their faith is not good. But then, heavy-handed repression of people who might be critical of immigration, or, pretending that everything's fine with mass migration. There's not an issue there. I mean, it's a nuanced issue, but the main thing is don't get caught up in a provocation. That's what I would urge people to do. Don't get caught up in some kind of provocation. Don't get caught up in some kind of provocation. That is my advice to you, right? Focus on getting the job done. Don't join a mob created by social media. Don't get honeypotted into one of these social media schemes. Be very, very careful. I mean, we remember January 6th. A lot of people thought they could walk into the Capitol. They were led to believe they could walk into the Capitol. The doors were open and they walked right in. And then what happened? Right? So be very careful. I am urging you, especially between now and November 5th, when the election happens, be fucking careful, right? DNC, if you're at the DNC, be really careful, right? Because there's a lot of provocateurism going on, right? There's a lot of crazy stuff going on right now. Don't join a social media mob, right? And be very careful. That is what I'm urging people. Be very careful. That's what I'm urging you, because I mean, this is bizarro world, and they're so there we go. All righty. No evidence for any god or gods. Do you believe in non-evidentiary claims? Well, I got evidence for you, David. And again, I don't want to debate you, because, religion is a personal journey. And I don't think I'm going to convince you that God exists, but can something come out of nothing? Can something come out of nothing? Right? We're to believe that at one point there was nothing, and then there became something, and the Big Bang just happened. Just something appeared. I mean, if something can come out of nothing, that would indicate there has to be something beyond the material realm. Okay? And if you can explain how something comes out of nothing, without there being other forces that exist, and then you say, well, where did God come from? I don't know. Where did the spiritual forces come from? I don't know. But I'm not claiming that they came out of nowhere. That's you're kind of missing the point. That's just a rhetorical trick. I mean, obviously there is material, right? The material world is the most obvious world, right? But at some point, the universe started, right? And where did it come from, right? So there we go. I mean, and yeah, but there you go. Anyway, all right. What is your definition of imperialism? Imperialism is a system. It is the rule of the world by big banks and big corporations. It is the rule of the world by monopolies. It is the export of capital. It is the fact that corporations dominate the global economy and hold back development. It is an international financial oligarchy. It is trusts, cartels, and syndicates. Lenin wrote a very, very good definition of imperialism. And I go by the Leninist definition of imperialism. And if you don't want to read the big, long book that Lenin wrote, read Imperialism and the Split in Socialism by Vladimir Lenin. This is a very, very good essay in which he gives his, the third paragraph is where he defines what imperialism is. And then he talks about divisions in the socialist movement and why you can't really be a socialist without being an imperialist. So, yes, I take the Leninist definition of imperialism. Imperialism is holding back economic development. Imperialism is an economic system that is keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. Imperialism is a historical stage of capitalism. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. It is the supplanting of free competition by monopoly and the quintessence of imperialism. It is cartels, trusts, and syndicates, the monopolistic position of big banks, the seizure of raw materials by an international financial oligarchy, the economic partition of the world. That's what imperialism is. Lenin gives a very good definition that I cite in We Are City Builders. I cite in this textbook, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. The Leninist definition of imperialism as a system, not a policy. Imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is a system. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Look, folks, we have to just focus on getting the job done, right? There's a book that is very difficult to read. Very, very difficult to read. And it's considered one of the main Marxist-Leninist texts. It's Lenin's book, What Is to Be Done? And it's interesting because there are probably people who would accuse me of deviating from this, as I'm not building a Leninist party formation. I'm not talking about democratic centralism, but oddly, I feel like I have actually studied this book enough to really get the essence of what it's about. Not the routine, not the dogmatic, and now we must form the newspaper, and now we must, but to really get the essence of what this book is saying, right? It's a very difficult book to read because it has so many outdated references and names in it, right? But what is to be done? If you read the book, he's saying, how can we actually win? How can we actually build a revolutionary movement that could actually succeed in building socialism? And the reason that the book is so important is because Lenin actually did it. He did create a revolutionary movement. And he did actually win. And so it is very important. And it's not an easy book to get through because there are so many old newspapers and it's very hard to read. But I feel like I've studied it enough. I actually met my wife when I was teaching classes on this book. And, it's hard to get through. It's extremely difficult to read because of all the outdated references, etc. But if you can get the essence of what he's saying, not the literal understanding of what he's saying, because he wrote this well over 100 years ago. It was published in 1903. As a pamphlet in Tsarist Russia about how to build a revolutionary movement, right? It's a bit outdated, But the essence is to get to, the point is to get to the essence of what he's saying, not to get to the, not to get to the literal interpretation of now we must form a newspaper. Now we must find the agitator. No, get to the essence of what he's saying about how to view the job, right? If you can follow that, right, you can really learn from it. And I am going to put a quote from that book on the screen. I just have to pull it up on my phone here, right? Because I think it really applies to what we're doing right now. I mean, I see in the chat, there's just such a big effort to get us off focus, to get us caught up in bullshit. And I want you to read this quote, because this is really what it means to be a revolutionary in our time. And I'm going to put this quote on the screen, right? I'm just going to email myself the screenshot of it, because I mean, I continue. Well, I'll put the quote on the screen because I come back to it. I come back to this quote over and over again, because especially now, this quote is just popping into my mind. It's funny. I'm talking more about Lenin than I usually do. I'm on here saying, don't be dogmatic, but I'm actually on this stream, I'm quoting Lenin about imperialism. And now I'm quoting Lenin about what it means to be a revolutionary organizer, because, all right. So we're going to put this quote on the screen, this quote that explains the essence of what we are doing. Right. And, this is from chapter 1 of Lenin's great book, What Is to Be Done. I'm just going to show it to you because it's like, never has it been harder to, this really applies. We are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides by enemies, and we have to advance almost constantly under fire. We have combined by a freely adopted decision for the purpose of fighting the enemy and not of retreating into the neighboring marsh, the inhabitants of which, from the very outset, have reproached us with having separated ourselves into an exclusive group and with having chosen the path of struggle instead of the path of conciliation. And now some among us begin to cry out, "Let us go into the marsh." And when we begin to shame them, they retort, "What backward people you are! Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take a better road? Oh, yes, gentlemen, you are free not only to invite us, but to go yourselves wherever you will, even into the marsh. In fact, we think that the marsh is your proper place, and we are prepared to render your every assistance to get there. Only let go of our hands. Don't clutch at us, and don't besmirch the grand word of freedom, for we too are free to go where we please. Free not only against the marsh, but against those who are turning us toward the marsh." Now, this is Lenin describing how difficult it was to get the job done in his time. That a few of us have come together, taken each other by the hand, surrounded by enemies, constantly under fire, and we've made the decision to do what we need to do, to fight the enemy, to get the job done. And we are surrounded by enemies, and we're surrounded by forces that want to pull us into the marsh. And the slogan that they are using to go into the marsh, freedom. Freedom is what they say it's about. Well, you're free to go into the marsh. We're not going to stop you from going into the marsh, but don't try to drag us into the marsh with you. Right? Because we are free to keep doing what we're doing as well. Right? And I have never seen, the amount of desperation to get us off of the revolutionary road, to keep us from doing what we are doing, is massive. And we just have to focus on getting the job done. Right? And just just forget these people. Just forget the drama. Just forget the internet. Just forget the fools out there. We got to focus on making the job done. Right? We've got to focus on getting the job done. Not quibbling over little things, not getting tired, if you need to take time off, take time off. Not drama. We've got to focus. We've got to come together and we've got to march. And that's what we've got to do. And that there is just endless provocations. There's such a desperation to get us to stop what we are doing, to get us to stop getting the job done. Right? Do you think they would have banned my Kamala Harris book if I wasn't right over the target? Right? Why is it that I'm the only one who's bold enough to point out that Maduro supports Donald Trump? We are right over the target. We've got 1,000 Kamala Harris books to distribute at the Democratic National Convention. We have a beautiful pamphlet that explains anti-imperialism and growth and everything beautifully. I mean, we're doing amazing work that nobody else is doing. We are engaging the masses. We are meeting people who would never go looking for this and bringing them into a revolutionary movement. We're doing the work that must be done. And there's a lot of jokers out there, and there's a lot of fools who are, and they're doing one thing today and they're doing another thing tomorrow, right? And we don't have time to chase after all of them. We don't have time. We ain't got time for that shit. The Uhuru case is about to start. We have designed door knockers. I wish you could see. They're finalizing the door knocker. Thousands of people are going to get a door knocker on their door about the Uhuru case, warning them about what's going on with Chairman O'Malley and all of that because of our organization. Beautiful. Shout out to Noah. Shout out to Rachel. They did a great job finishing it. Right? We are getting the job done. We have a job to do, and we have to get the job done. Right? And yes, I have been very heavily persecuted already. And part of the reason that we need to forget about these other jackoffs is because they view every persecution that I face as an opportunity for themselves. Right? And don't show me one tweet they made about the Uhuru case. They ain't doing shit for the Uhuru case. They don't care about the Uhuru case. They want likes and shares and all of that. They don't give a shit about the Uhuru, right? They make one tweet so they can say they did it. We're out there trying to raise awareness. We're sending people everywhere we can. They don't give a shit about the Uhuru case, okay? They don't. And they view any persecution that comes down on me as an opportunity for themselves. And they blatantly said so. So we need to just forget these people, right? If they want to go into a marsh, they want to go into the marsh, let them go into the marsh. Let them go into the marsh, right? I mean, that is the way we have to view this. And that's in what is to be done. They can go into the marsh if they want. And go ahead, go into the marsh. This is what is to be done. Go into the marsh, right? You're free to do that, but we're free to not go into the marsh with you. We're free to not get led off the cliff, right? That's what we're free to do. I've got a Rumble rant. I better scroll up. I didn't see this Rumble rant. Hold on. Oh, wow. Wow, I missed it. Here we go. We got a Rumble rant. Why was Iran chosen to be an enemy of the U.S.? Just trying to understand why the deep state wants Americans to hate Iran. Well, Iran used to be a U.S.-backed dictatorship. Iran used to be a U.S.-backed dictatorship, and it had the Shah, was the military dictator, and the Shah of Iran, he had the power, etc. And then there was an uprising, there was an economic crisis, and the Shah was brought down. And there were different forces that emerged out of that revolution. But Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, He became the main force that was able to give voice to the anti-imperialist sentiments of the Iranian people. And actually, and this might make some Iranians watching angry to hear this, especially Iranian communists, Sam Marcy, the founder of the Workers' World Party, always pointed out that Khomeini was the only consistent anti-imperialist in Iran. The Communist Party of Iran had cooperated with the British Empire, right? Because Iran, the Shah of Iran, who was like the king of Iran at the time of World War II, supported Hitler. He was not a communist. He was an anti-communist, but he was kind of a nationalist, and the British were his enemy. So the Shah of Iran supported Hitler. So the Communist Party and the Soviet Union and the British Empire invaded Iran together during World War II. And so a lot of Iranians saw the communists as agents of the British and agents of the Russians, and they didn't trust the communists. Because of that, because the Shah, the nationalist leader of Iran, the Shah had aligned with the Nazis in World War II because the British were his enemies. The Soviet Union and, the British Empire had a joint invasion of Iran. And that, I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it. They were fighting World War II. The Nazis were the main enemy. But because of that, a lot of Iranian nationalists and a lot of Iranians saw the communists as collaborators with imperialism. So that's an important thing you have to remember. And on top of that, so you had the Communist Party of Iran that was kind of discredited because of that. And then you also had the Maoist groups in Iran. There were a lot of Maoist groups that were aligned with China. But China said that the Soviet Union was the main danger to the people of the world. And in the 70s, when the Islamic Revolution of Iran happened, China was taking a pro-US position. And Mao, I believe, met with the Shah of Iran, and the Shah's wife or sister was given a big parade, and China was embracing the Shah because the Shah was a US-backed dictator, right? And they said the main enemy was the Soviet Union. So they had an anti-imperialist revolution in Iran. That was the main issue, was anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. It was more anti-British than anti-American, really, because it was British corporations. But death to America became the slogan because America was the most visible threat. But economically, it was the British that dominated Iran more than anybody. But because of that, right, the communists were kind of discredited. And that's a point that Sam Marcy makes. And Iranian communists don't like to hear that. But it's true, right? Khomeini was always against the British Empire. Khomeini was always against the foreign colonizer or whatever. And China and the Soviet Union, unfortunately, because of geopolitical games, were not consistent. And so Khomeini, this very, very conservative Islamic scholar, he had originally been a supporter of the Shah because the Shah was this conservative monarch, but the Shah was working with the Kennedy administration to implement all kinds of liberal reforms. And Khomeini was this very conservative cleric. He didn't agree. And so he went to exile, and he fled to Paris and London, and he was in exile. And they smuggled recordings of him into Iran, and all kinds of people in Iran listened to the sermons of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was considered the far right. He thought the Shah was too Western, was too modern. And the Shah very much, he ordered all Iranian men to wear ties so that they looked like Westerners. The Shah loved the West. And the Shah's regime was also very sexually, they were really into free love. And the inner circles of the Shah were full of sexual promiscuity, wild sex parties and orgies and stuff like that. And the people of Iran are deeply conservative, especially the people in the countryside are very religious. And so at the time that the economy of Iran started crashing and burning, and there was an economic crisis, and there was an oil workers strike, and the people of Iran rose up and revolted, Khomeini became the person who gave voice to their feelings because he was socially conservative, and the Shah was viewed as a Western playboy who had wild sex parties. Because the communists had not been consistent in their anti-imperialism, and Khomeini, people in the countryside of Iran, working class people, and a lot of people in the Iranian military listened to Khomeini's sermons. And Khomeini became, the figure who became the leader of the anti-colonial revolution in Iran. And the other thing, though, is that in the 1970s, and this is interesting, Khomeini was mainly a conservative cleric, but in the 1970s, Khomeini was very heavily influenced by the New Left and by the wave of anti-colonial revolutions. And if you read his sermons from the 1970s, he really starts emphasizing opposition to capitalism and opposition to imperialism, and supporting the IRA and supporting and admiring Che Guevara, and that he sounds a lot like a communist, but then he denounces communism, right? He denounces communism as an atheist ideology, etc. But he emphasizes, his slogan is not capitalism, but Islam, neither East nor West. And they view communism as this kind of movement of rich intellectuals who are out of touch with the people, and the people are deeply religious, is the feeling. The people are deeply religious and conservative, and the Shah is this decadent, westernized playboy who has wild sex parties and has all this money while the people are starving. And so the people of Iran, the military, the deeply conservative military, the people of the countryside, and they revolted, and Khomeini came to power. And there was a lot of confusion after Khomeini came to power, because a lot of the communists wanted to have a communist revolution, etc. But Khomeini, he was calling himself Imam Khomeini, and that was a hint that it might be the end times, right? So, Christians believe that Jesus will return. Muslims also believe that Jesus will return, but they believe he will return alongside the Mahdi. Right? This is very interesting. Muslims believe in Jesus. They call him Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him. That's what they call him, right? And the Muslims also believe that Jesus will return at the end times, but that Jesus will be escorted by Mahdi. And the Sunni Muslims believe that Mahdi is an angel that God will send at the end of the world. But Shia Muslims believe that Mahdi is the 12th Imam. Right? The Shia Muslims believe that after Prophet Muhammad, there's 12 imams, right? And the last imam is Imam Mahdi. And Imam Mahdi is the last imam, and he's always present on the earth in every generation. It's very similar to the Jewish teaching on the Messiah. In every generation, there is one Mahdi, that he just kind of reincarnates in every generation. But at the end of the world, the last Imam Mahdi will make himself present, will make himself known and visible, and Jesus will return and also make himself present and visible, and they will lead a global revolution to create, a global revolution of the oppressed, to create God's kingdom on earth. That is what Shia Muslims believe, right? The last Imam comes to usher in global revolution, global uprising, and bring justice for the oppressed, to bring justice for the oppressed. So Khomeini, he never said he was the Mahdi, but he started calling himself Imam Khomeini, hinting that he might be the Mahdi. And he came back to Iran, and there was this religious uprising in Iran, and he's there. And he's saying not capitalism, but Islam, neither East nor West, right? And Shia Muslims all over the world believed it was the end times, and all over the world, wherever you had Shia Muslims, there were armed uprisings. They thought, they thought it was the end times, and Iraq is majority Shia, and it's right next to Iran. And Iraq is an Arab country, right? The Iranians are Persians, but the Iraqis are Arabs. But Iraq, the majority are Shia Muslims. So Saddam Hussein was the military, was the socialist leader of Iraq, I guess. But he was a strong man, and he was a secular leader, and he was from a Sunni religious background. But he was, was Ba'athist Arab socialism. And Saddam Hussein feared that the Islamic Revolution of Iran would spread into Iraq. And so Iraq invaded Iran, and you had the Iraq-Iran War. And Iraq was led by Ba'athist Arab socialism, which is a secular government that is like a secular form of socialism aligned with the Soviet Union. That's like Arab socialism, but it's secular. And the Shia Muslims of Iran were very religious, and the Persians and the Arabs, there's a long history of ethnic rivalry between the two groups. And Iraq invaded, and Iraq was aligned with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union gave aid to Iraq. So on that basis, Khomeini, the Iranians thought that the communists of Iran were on the wrong side. They were working for Iraq. And so there was heavy persecution of communists, and Khomeini basically cemented his leadership of Iran because of the fact that that Iraq invaded them, and Iraq was led by Marxists or Ba'athist Arab socialists who were aligned with the Soviet Union, right? And because of that, right, Khomeini kind of secured his grip on power because the communists were seen as traitors. Khomeini secured his grip on power. But in order to repel the Iraqi invaders, he had to basically form a planned economy in Iran. That may not have been his intention. He kept emphasizing we don't believe in it's neither capitalism or socialist, neither East nor West. War of poverty against wealth. He was always for the poor and against the rich. He was like a populist. But he always emphasized that we will have a market in Iran. We're not going to have a totally state-run economy. But when they got invaded by Iraq, in order to defeat the invaders, they had to completely militarize the economy, more or less. And he launched basically, it was very similar to what Stalin did with his 5-year plans. He called it construction jihad. And they mobilized the whole country to build. And they built thousands of hospitals, and they built thousands of power plants. They electrified the whole country. They built huge highways. And it was all part of defeating the Iraqi invaders. And he formed this organization they have in Iran called the Basij, which means the mobilized oppressed. And it's in every neighborhood. It's committees to defend the revolution, right? And that they are the people that were, when Iraq invaded, they were the local militia that would fight the Iraqi invaders. That became the basis of these Iranian government, right? The Islamic Revolution of Iran is this anti-colonial revolution that, has a largely state-run economy, that has these community organizations that carry out the goals of the revolution on a local level. And it's the people leading it are the clerics, are the ayatollahs. And after Khomeini died, the new leader is Khamenei, who's been elected by the Guardian Council, and he's the supreme leader of Iran. And the largest economic entity in Iran is called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And it's an army that is only accountable to the supreme leader, Khamenei. It's above the elected government. It's above the regular Iranian military, and they are the biggest economic entity in the country. And they build Iran's bridges, and they own huge, swaths of the country, and they're basically this like state-run paramilitary organization, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. And Iran associates their revolution with anti-colonial struggles around the world. They have a street in Iran named after Bobby Sands. They gave money to the IRA. They gave money to the people of South Africa and Nelson Mandela. They identify with anti-colonial revolutions. When they seized the embassy in Iran, they seized the embassy. There was the hostage crisis. They seized the U.S. embassy because they believed that after the revolution, the U.S. embassy was being used to spread separatist movements to break apart Iran. And they proved it. They found in their files that Arab separatists, Turkish separatists, and Kurdish separatists were being supported by the United States. They wanted to break apart Iran as a country. Well, they proved they were right. They seized the embassy. They proved in the paperwork that the USA was doing that. But when they seized the embassy, they let all the black people go because they said black people are oppressed in America. And so they freed all the black people, and they freed all the women, except for the women that were CIA agents, that were card-carrying CIA operatives. They kept a couple of the women that were CIA agents. And that, it's a complicated story, right? And that Iran, again, you can look at Iran as a synthesis. On the one hand, you have the deeply conservative, clerical Shia Islamic tradition. and their laws. I mean, it's like women's testimony in court doesn't count as much as a man's does, things like that. On the other hand, though, you can see a very big impact by Marxism. And even though they denounce and disavow Marxism, if you listen to Khomeini's sermons, he's talking about imperialism, and he's basically describing exactly what Lenin talked about imperialism. He's talking about an anti-colonial revolution. He's honoring Che Guevara. He's honoring Ho Chi Minh. He's honoring the IRA and Nelson Mandela. He sees his revolution as part of a global anti-colonial struggle, a revolution of the oppressed. And so it's complicated. Iran is a nuanced thing. It's a complicated anti-colonial revolution. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Iraq was the primary enemy of the United States in the Middle East, right? Because it was a socialist country, because it was a Soviet aligned country, because Baathism, because it was arming the Palestinians, etc. And so Iran in the 1990s pivoted toward the United States. And part of that, 1988, there was very heavy repression of Iranian communists, a lot of executions. And then in the 90s, Iran moved in a very pro-U.S. direction, a lot of market privatizations, cuts in social services, a lot of pivoting toward the United States, aligning with the United States against Iraq, etc. But then you'll remember that after 9/11, George W. Bush gave his axis of evil speech. And when George W. Bush gave his axis of evil speech, he called Iran the axis of evil. And then when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, the oil prices shot up. And that resulted in the hardliners of Iran, the Revolutionary Guards that control the oil money, getting a lot more money. And that also resulted in Iran seeing itself as a country that was under threat and under attack and moving in a more anti-imperialist direction. And when Ahmadinejad became president of Iran, that was a turning point. And there are a lot of Iranian communists that I have met that were able to suddenly go home after Ahmadinejad was elected. Ahmadinejad became president, and suddenly they fled Iran. They were living in America. They were living in other countries. But when Ahmadinejad got elected, they were able to go home. And Ahmadinejad's presidency marked a very significant pivot of Iran into a very anti-imperialist direction. Hugo Chavez visited Iran and hugged Ahmadinejad. And Ahmadinejad was the first president they'd ever had who was not a cleric, right? He had no beard. He was an engineer. He was from a political party called the Alliance of Builders, right? And he was an engineer, and he had been a communist before the Islamic Revolution, before he converted to Islam. He had been a Maoist communist, right? And Ahmadinejad, who I've met, I've been in the same room as him. I'm photographed with Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad, pivoted Iran in a very anti-imperialist direction. And Iran is the main sponsor of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And in 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon, and Hezbollah kicked their ass. Hezbollah demolished Israel. The Israeli invaders didn't know what hit them. Hezbollah is it's like half of Lebanon is run by Hezbollah, which is this Shia Islamic organization that is very much inspired by Iran. And Israel invaded, and they had snipers on every roof, and people went out, and Israel got their ass handed to them by Hezbollah. And so at that point, Iran became more or less the center of anti-imperialism in the Middle East, and Iran pivoted in a very, very anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist direction. And as they rebuilt Lebanon after the Israeli invasion, they put up murals with the face of Che Guevara on them, with the face of Hugo Chavez on them. And the Communist Party of Lebanon aligned itself with Hezbollah, and that Iran was the center of global anti-imperialism in the Middle East. And so ever since then, Iran, they basically are an anti-colonial. They are a center of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist resistance. The Houthis of Yemen base themselves largely are inspired by the Islamic Revolution of Iran. There's a movement in Bahrain, and the people of Bahrain, the Shia majority of Bahrain, that are inspired, and funded probably by Iran to protest for, against the king that's imposed on them by Saudi Arabia. The Palestinian resistance sees Iran as its main supporter. At this point, Iran is the center of resistance to Israel and to U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. And they are aligned with China, and they are aligned with Russia, and they are aligned with the Palestinians. Hamas and Iran don't exactly get along, right? And that's complicated. But, Syria, right, was a country that the USA was trying to overthrow. And Syria is led by the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. It's a secular government. But Iran sent its military to Syria to support the Syrian Ba'ath government. Right. Iran has Iraq, the USA invaded. It has a Shia majority, and there's been a rise of Sunni fanatics, Wahhabis, who want to kill Shia. And so Iran has had to give a lot of military support to various Shia Muslim communities in Iraq. And so there's a lot of Iraqis who are protected by Iran, who are protected by militias in Iraq that are aligned with Iran and take inspiration from the Islamic Revolution of Iran. They call it the axis of resistance is the term that they use. Bush called them the axis of evil, and they say, well, we're actually the axis of resistance. And that's what they call themselves. And Iran is an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist society led by a very religious and socially conservative government, that is fighting imperialism. That's what Iran is. And Iran has problems, and there's no question about it. And, I'm not going to pretend that Iran is a perfect society. It's got a lot of problems, right? And I'm not a Shia Muslim, but I am very moved. I had religious, it's how I returned to God, was from my time in Iran. I didn't become a Muslim. I became a Christian again. But Iran, it's people that are motivated by their religious faith to fight imperialism, to stand with the oppressed. I've been there. I've made documentaries about it, right? They took control of their oil, and they've wiped out illiteracy in their country, and they've built modern highways, and they've electrified the whole country, and they've done some pretty amazing things, and they are aligned with all the forces around the world that are fighting imperialism. So I think the Islamic Revolution of Iran has had a good impact. And that's why I sat down. I was able to interview Ibrahim Riazi, the president of Iran. That's why I met Ahmadinejad, and I had a meeting with Ahmadinejad when I was in Iran in 2015. I've been some places and done some stuff, and I think that the Islamic Revolution of Iran is a revolution that's worth studying. Obviously, something like that would never happen in America because we're not Muslims here. We're Christians, and we have a different background, and we have a different culture, and we have different circumstances. We have a tradition of separation of church and state, etc. But I made a documentary film about Iran. It's called Iranian Dream. You can, on my website, if you go to films, you can watch it. If you go to calebmaupin.net, there's 3 films, and one's called Iranian Dream. And it's a film that I made when I visited Iran in 2015. It was a film I made for Iranian television about how I saw the supreme leader of Iran. So you can watch this whole, film I made for Iranian TV about being an American and visiting Iran and what it's like to live and walk the streets of Iran, etc. So go watch Iranian Dream. I'll post the link in the chat for Iranian Dream. The Islamic Revolution of Iran, again, there's the Iranian people have a beautiful history. A beautiful history, a beautiful culture, etc. And that, these are important points that need to be understood. Let me just leave it at that. But anyway, I could talk about Iran all night because I've been there and I've seen it. And it's a complicated history that we don't really understand in the West. But anyway, so I see there's another question. Any knowledge of Dominic Lissardo? Any knowledge of I think it's called Dominic Lissardo tree? And the reason I am learning about Marxism, I don't know about the tree of Dominic Lissardo. Dominic Lissardo is a Marxist intellectual. He wrote books defending Stalin. He wrote a very good book critiquing liberalism. He died recently, and after his death, people, told me about him, and I read some of his stuff, and it's pretty good. I mean, he's a genuine communist. He's like a Michael Parenti, except he focuses more on the philosophical angle of things. So there we go. All right, folks. It's been 3 hours. It's almost 2 a.m, but hey, I'm glad you all are here. We oppose imperialism. We stand with the forces of the world that resist imperialism, and the future of America is opposing imperialism as well. These are scary times, and I would urge you, again, I would urge you to avoid being honeypotted. Avoid any traps. Avoid any traps. If someone looks like they're trying to set up some kind of, provocation, get the hell out of there. You don't want to go to jail, right? And, you look at January 6th, and you look at, that whole thing in Michigan where some people got set up for trying to kidnap the governor. We got to go to the masses with anti-imperialism, and we got to not get caught up in provocations, right? Don't make the mistake of the people in Britain who went and joined that mob, right? Don't get caught up in provocations. That's my advice to you. Don't get caught up in provocations, and don't let social media trip you up into getting caught up in provocations, right? Pull up the quote from Lenin one more time, right? One more time. Remember, we are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides by enemies, and we have to advance under almost constant fire. We have been combined by a freely adopted decision for the purpose of fighting the enemy and of not retreating into the neighboring marsh, the inhabitants of which, from their very outset, have reproached us with having separated ourselves into an exclusive group and with having chosen the path of struggle instead of the path of social media. I mean, consolation. And now some of us begin to cry out, let us go into the marsh. And when we begin to shame them, they retort, what backward people you are. Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take a better road? Oh, yes, gentlemen. You are free not only to invite us, but to go yourselves, you will, even into the marsh. In fact, we think the marsh is your proper place. We are prepared to render every assistance to get you there. Only let go of our hands. Don't clutch at us. And don't besmirch the grand word freedom, for we too are free to go where we please, free to fight not only against the marsh, but also against those who are turning us towards the marsh. And on that note, I'm ending tonight's stream. Putting on the closing music. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.